I'll support you. Hello, everybody. Stable as a barn. Hey, thanks, Don. I do like this song a lot. How's everybody doing today? I put on this shirt, but then it turns out it's hot in here. It's very hot. Oh, Seattle, why? No air conditioning. Hi. Stagger Don, Nathan Thin, Harvest, Warren, put on 2 shirts. The solution to being too hot is even more shirts. Air conditioning is pretty vital, but nobody has it up here. Air circulation in a place that has humidity and constant rain? What's that? Why do we need that up here? That's dumb. It's a good day for a book and a birthday. Is it your birthday today, Don? A desert tunic, yeah. Really, I should be wearing like the equivalent of a nightgown. Just like a really big, baggy, but breezy cloak, like. Ask Zek about the desert tunic? Alright. I'll drop it in there. I put it in there because I will forget after this. Happy birthday, Dawn! Yay! I hope you're having a great birthday! Harvest, if you need some sleep, feel free to go get that sleep. Feel free to go get that. You too, Warren? Man, what is up with neighbors right now? My neighbors have also been pretty loud recently, but I think they're like trying to do some work. The bathroom is on that side of like right next to my head. I think they're doing some work in their bathroom or something. Oh, well, thank you, Harvest. It'll only be a couple of hours anyways. You went to bed at 5 a.m.? Well, geez, y'all are making me feel better about my like messed up sleep schedule right here. AC is optional in cars sold up north. Yeah, they really shouldn't be. We have like 2 to 3 weeks of above 90-degree weather, and everybody's like, it's a hot flash. I'm like, that's not, that, it happens every summer. That's not what that is. Damn, alright. You guys happen to live in the same street? I know you don't, so that's fair. I guess countries are the same no matter where you go in the world. Having rain? I wish we were having rain. I shouldn't have worn a turtleneck. Hey, Bully Birdie! Oh, I got another emote! I got the ace koala. Bully Birdie, thank you for resubscribing. Welcome back to the fold. And also, Matter of Dragons, thank you for resubscribing at a tier 3 as a spectral summoner. I don't know if you're still in the chat, but thank you for doing that at the beginning of the stream. I'm doing alright. I'm doing it alright. Door was kicked in? Oh my god, Warren. Man, you guys have had some bad nights. I apologize for how bad your nights have been. Oh, you got a birthday sub? That's super cute. The same guy has gotten arrested 3 times. Well. Well. I don't super know what to say. The like most intense thing that I've seen in my neighborhood, aside from the people arguing about Black Lives Matter in their garage at 3 a.m. And also they were like teenagers outside who were definitely like flirting or something at 4 a.m. But the weirdest thing that I saw happened at a normal daytime hour, and it was my neighbors, and they were like standing out in the middle of the street screaming. Like I thought somebody was screaming for their kid who was about to get run over by a truck, but it was just this dude, and he was screaming, and I was like, what is going on? And I realized that what was going on was that he was waiting outside of his house for a food delivery, and he was really mad at the delivery driver for being late, I think, because the delivery driver, I think, had gotten lost. And I was like worried that the delivery driver, because the delivery driver when he came was brown, and I was in like, it was definitely like a racially charged situation. I was worried for the delivery driver. It was a little bit concerning. But it's okay. I think that restaurant blacklisted my neighbor, so there you go. Big Karen energy. Yeah. Yeah. No, yeah, the delivery driver was. The delivery driver was indeed very scared. I had to like get out of the car to give him the thing, and it was just a lot. This stream is more STL. The streets are empty. Where my McMuffin at? Ah, nice, Dawn. Perfect timing. A tiny cottage. Oh. You're so sentimental about Dorian. That's great. We did not get very far in Dorian because we had a big discussion about authorship and like publications and identities being used for books and how that affects the interpretations of the books. That's where we were at last stream. To catch everybody up with where we're at with A Picture of Dorian Gray, we were introduced to Dorian, Lord Henry, and oh my god, what is the last guy? What's the name of the painter guy? And a painter. And the painter was friends with Dorian and believes that Dorian is the most beautiful man that he's ever seen, and also that Dorian is sheltered and perfect and needs to be protected. But unfortunately, while this painter guy is talking to his friend Lord Henry, Dorian comes over, and this painter guy is like, dude, Lord Henry, I know you're like a bit of a shit. Don't fucking corrupt Dorian, okay? I'm telling you, don't corrupt Dorian. And Lord Henry's like, don't worry, I'm not gonna corrupt Dorian. And then Lord Henry proceeds to corrupt Dorian right in front of the painter's face and basically steal Dorian away from the painter. And the painter is like, his heart is shattered, and he's like, oh no, my perfect, pure creature has been destroyed because of Lord Henry. And that's pretty much what's been happening. Is Dorian and Lord Henry have been hanging out for a bit, and we've been able to see a little inklings. We know a bit about Dorian's past because Lord Henry's just been like schmoozing around all of the socialite circles of London and trying to dig up dirt on Dorian. And Dorian's past is that his mom was super pretty and married a man that she loved, and then her father basically murdered the guy essentially to get his daughter away from him, and then his daughter had Dorian and then also died of sorrow or something. So Dorian's past is like riddled with sadness. And that's pretty much where we left off, and we left off right before a time skip, thankfully. And yeah, we have an accurate, appropriate PDF now. The last PDF we used last stream was actually a abridged version. So if you were using it and some things didn't match up, that is why. And we will begin reading at chapter 4 of the new unabridged PDF. Have I been getting fireworks every night? Nah. Is Mara good? Mara is good, Warren. Yes, I like it. It's a lot more like Portia, though. It's a lot more like quest-based than, like Harvest Moon, like farming-based. It's less sandboxy, more quest-based, but I do like it. I think it's pretty good. A Mr. Hotbody? Oh yeah, there was a person whose last name was something like that. You clearly don't remember this book at all. We're still in the very, very beginning. We only managed to make it 3 chapters in, so it's alright. The main things that you need to know are that basically what happened was Lord Henry spoke to Dorian and was like, hey, did you know that people will only love you for as long as you're beautiful, and your beauty is fleeting, and someday you're going to be ugly and everybody's going to hate you. Doesn't that suck? You should live up your life while you can, because you're only beautiful for now and you're going to be ugly and people are going to hate you. And like, that's just what Lord Henry did. And Dorian was like, oh god, you're right, and had like a big old speech about the portrait of him and was like, I wish that I could be young forever like this portrait. This portrait is better than me. And the painter in him had like a tiff about it. The painter was like, but this is my masterwork. And Dorian was like, I hate it because it's going to be more beautiful than me forever. And the painter's like, now my work is ruined. And it's like a whole thing. Henry sounds smart. Henry's not. Basil. Basil's the painter's name. Yes, thank you, Dawn. Probably just be listening, have to cut up the lilac. Good luck. Oh, Uncle Hotbody? I think so. You thought it was more of a "you're so pretty, I wish I hadn't aged, you need to cherish your beauty while you have it." He definitely didn't say "I wish I hadn't aged." He just definitely said, "Hey, you know your painter friend? Your painter friend only likes you because you're pretty. Guess what's gonna happen to you when you're older? Haha. Youth is fleeting. Your life's gonna suck." Like that's pretty much the whole conversation that he had. Lord Henry has been painted through the beginning of the book as a very cynical person, even though truthfully on the inside, according to Basil the painter, Lord Henry is not actually, like, Lord Henry says stupid stuff that he doesn't actually believe because he's not actually that cynical on the inside, but he likes to say cynical things to sound smart. That's basically what Basil's opinion of Lord Henry is. Lord Henry insists that he actually doesn't care about anything or anyone, and that he only cares about, like, beauty and ideals, and, like, morality is for suckers, and sin is fake, and, like, that's Lord Henry is like, I'm just a lazy, lackadaisical man who likes to say things, and I'm so cynical and cultivated and modern. I'm sorry, these are now more my interpretations of the characters, but there you go. So, with that being said, we are going to begin with Chapter 4 of The Picture of Dorian Gray. And like I said, this is a time skip, so keep that in mind. One afternoon, a month later, Dorian Gray was reclining in a luxurious armchair in the little library of Lord Henry's house in Mayfair. It was, in its way, a very charming room, with its high-paneled wainscoting of olive-stained oak, its cream-colored frieze, and ceiling of raised plasterwork, and its brick-dust felt carpet strewn with silk, long-fringed Persian rugs. On a tiny satinwood table stood a statuette by Clodion, and beside it lay a copy of Les Cent Nouvelles, bound for Margaret of Valois by Clovis Eve, and powdered with the gilt daisies that Queen had selected for her device. Some large blue china jars and parrot tulips were ranged on the mantel shelf, and through the small leaded panels of the window streamed the apricot-colored light of a summer day in London. Lord Henry had not yet come in. He was always late on principle, his principle being that punctuality is the thief of time. So the lad was looking rather sulky, as with listless fingers he turned over the pages of an elaborately illustrated edition of Manon Lescaut that he had found in one of the bookcases. The formal monotonous ticking of the Louis Quatorze clock annoyed him. Once or twice he thought of going away. At last he heard a step outside, and the door opened. "How late you are, Harry!" he murmured. "I'm afraid it is not Harry, Mr. Gray." Oh, I'm afraid it is not Harry, Mr. Gray," answered a shrill voice. He glanced quickly round and rose to his feet. "I beg your pardon. You thought it was my husband. It is only his wife. You must let me introduce myself. I know you quite well by your photographs. I think my husband has got 17 of them." "Not 17, Lady Henry." "Well, 18 then. And I saw you with him the other night at the opera." She laughed nervously as she spoke, and watched him with her vague, forget-me-not eyes. She was a curious woman, whose dresses always looked as if they had been designed in a rage and put on in a tempest. She was usually in love with somebody, and, as her passion was never returned, she had kept all her illusions. She tried to look picturesque, but only succeeded in being untidy. Her name was Victoria, and she had a perfect mania for going to church. "That was at Lohengrin, Lady Henry, I think?" "Yes, it was at dear Lohengrin. I like Wagner's music better than anybody's. It is so loud that one can talk the whole time without other people hearing what one says. That is a great advantage. Don't you think so, Mr. Gray?" For the record, Dorian is a pianist, so he plays piano. The same nervous staccato laugh broke from her thin lips, and her fingers began to play with a long tortoise-shell paper knife. Dorian smiled and shook his head. "I am afraid I don't think so, Lady Henry. I never talk during music, at least during good music. If one hears bad music, it is one's duty to drown it in conversation." "Ah, That is one of Harry's views, isn't it, Mr. Gray? I always hear Harry's views from his friends. It is the only way I get to know of them. But you must not think I don't like good music. I adore it, but I'm afraid of it. It makes me too romantic. I have simply worshipped pianists, 2 at a time sometimes, Harry tells me. I don't know what it is about them. Perhaps it is that they are foreigners. They all are, aren't they? Even those that are born in England become foreigners after a time, don't they? It is so clever of them and such a compliment to art. Makes it quite cosmopolitan, doesn't it? You have never been to any of my parties, have you, Mr. Gray? You must come. I can't afford orchids, but I spare no expense in foreigners. They make one's rooms look so picturesque. But here's Harry! Harry, I came in to look for you, to ask you something. I forget what it was, and I found Mr. Gray here. We have had such a pleasant chat about music. We have quite the same ideas. No, I think our ideas are quite different, but he has been most pleasant. I'm so glad I've seen him. I am charmed, my love, quite charmed, said Lord Henry, elevating his dark crescent-shaped eyebrows and looking at them both with an amused smile. So sorry I'm late, Dorian. I went to look after a piece of old brocade in Wardour Street and had to bargain it for hours for it. Nowadays people know the price of everything and the value of nothing. I'm afraid I must be going, exclaimed Lady Henry, breaking an awkward silence with her silly sudden laugh. I have promised to drive with the Duchess. Goodbye, Mr. Gray. Goodbye, Harry. You're dining out, I suppose? So am I. Perhaps I shall see you at Lady Thornbury's. I dare say, my dear, said Lord Henry, shutting the door behind her, as, looking like a bird of paradise that had been out all night in the rain, she flittered out of the room, leaving a faint odor of frangipani. Then he lit a cigarette and flung himself down on the sofa. Never marry a woman with straw-colored hair, Dorian, he said after a few puffs. Why, Henry? Because they are so sentimental. But I like sentimental people. Never marry at all, Dorian. Men marry because they are tired. Women because they are curious. Both are disappointed. I don't think I'm likely to marry, Henry. I am too much in love. That is one of your aphorisms. I'm putting it into practice, as I do everything that you say. Who are you in love with? Asked Lord Henry after a pause. With an actress, said Dorian Gray, blushing. Lord Henry shrugged his shoulders. That is a rather commonplace debut. You would not say so if you saw her, Harry. Who is she? Her name is Sybil Vane. Never heard of her. No one has. People will some day, however. She is a genius. My dear boy, no woman is a genius. Women are a decorative sex. They never have anything to say, but they say it charmingly. Women represent the triumph of matter over mind, just as men represent the triumph of mind over morals. Harry, how can you? My dear Dorian, it is quite true. I am analyzing women at the present, so I ought to know. The subject is not so abstruse as I thought it was. I find that, ultimately, there are only 2 kinds of women, the plain and the colored. The plain women are very useful. If you want to gain a reputation for respectability, you have merely to take them down to supper. The other women are very charming. They commit one mistake, however. They paint in order to try and look young. Our grandmothers painted in order to try and talk brilliantly. Rouge and esprit used to go together. That is all over now. As long as a woman can look 10 years younger than her own daughter, she is perfectly satisfied. As for conversation, there are only 5 women in London worth talking to, and 2 of these can't be admitted into decent society. However, tell me about your genius. How long have you known her? Ah, Harry, your views terrify me. Never mind that. How long have you known her? About 3 weeks. And where did you come across her? I will tell you, Harry, but you mustn't be unsympathetic about it. After all, it never would have happened if I had not met you. You filled me with a wild desire to know everything about life. For days after I met you, something seemed to throb in my veins. As I lounged in the park or strolled down Piccadilly, I used to look at every one who passed me and wonder, with a mad curiosity, what sort of lives they led. Some of them fascinated me, others filled me with terror. There was an exquisite poison in the air. I had a passion for sensations. Well, one evening about 7 o'clock, I determined to go out in search of some adventure. I felt that this grey, monstrous London of ours, with its myriads of people, its sordid sinners, and its splendid sins, as you once phrased it, must have something in store for me. I fancied 1,000 things. The mere danger gave me a sense of delight. I remembered what you had said to me on that wonderful evening when we first dined together, about the search for beauty being the real secret of life. I don't know what I expected, but I went out and wandered eastward, and soon losing my way in a labyrinth of grimy streets and black, grassless squares. About 8:30 I passed by an absurd little theatre with great flaring gas jets and gaudy playbills. Oh God, I apologize. A hideous Jew, in the most amazing waistcoat I ever beheld in my life, was standing at the entrance smoking a vile cigar. He had greasy ringlets, and an enormous diamond blazed in the center of a soiled shirt. "Have a box, my lord?" he said when he saw me, and he took off his hat with an air of gorgeous servility. There was something about him, Harry, that amused me. He was such a monster. You will laugh at me, I know, but I really went in and paid a whole guinea for the stage box. To the present day I can't make out why I did so. And yet if I hadn't, my dear Harry, if I hadn't, I should have missed the greatest romance of my life. I see you are laughing. It is horrid of you. I am not laughing, Dorian. At least I'm not laughing at you. But you should not say the greatest romance of your life. You should say the first romance of your life. You will always be loved, and you will always be in love with love. A grande passion is the privilege of people who have nothing to do. That is the one use of the idle classes of a country. Don't be afraid. There are exquisite things in store for you. This is merely the beginning. Do you think my nature so shallow? Cried Dorian Gray angrily. No, I think your nature is so deep. How do you mean? My dear boy, the people who love only once in their lives are really the shallow people. What they call their loyalty and their fidelity, I call either the lethargy of custom or their lack of imagination. Faithfulness is to the emotional life what consistency is to the life of the intellect. Simply a confession of failures. Faithfulness. I must analyze it some day. The passion for property is in it. There are many things that we would throw away if we were not afraid that others might pick them up. But I don't want to interrupt you. Go on with your story. Well, I found myself seated in a horrid little private box with a vulgar drop scene staring me in the face. I looked out from behind the curtain and surveyed the house. It was a tawdry affair, all cupids and cornucopias, like a third-rate wedding cake. The gallery and pit were fairly full, but the 2 rows of dingy stalls were quite empty, and there was hardly a person in what I suppose they called the dress circle. The women went about with oranges and ginger beer, and there was a terrible consumption of nuts going on. It must have been just like the palmy days of the British drama. Just like, I should fancy, and very depressing. I began to wonder what on earth I should do when I caught sight of the playbill. What do you think the play was, Harry? I should think The Idiot Boy, or Dumb but Innocent. Our fathers used to like that sort of piece, I believe. The longer I live, Dorian, the more keenly I feel that whatever was good enough for our fathers is not good enough for us. In art as in politics, les grands-pères ont toujours tort. This play was good enough for us, Harry. It was Romeo and Juliet. I must admit that I was rather annoyed at the idea of seeing Shakespeare done in such a wretched hole of a place. Still, I felt interested in a sort of way. At any rate, I determined to wait for the first act. There was a dreadful orchestra, presided over by a young Hebrew who sat at a cracked piano, that nearly drove me away, but at last the drop scene was drawn up and the play began. Romeo was a stout elderly gentleman with corked eyebrows, a husky tragedy voice, and a figure like a beer barrel. Mercutio was almost as bad. He was played by the low comedian who had introduced gags of his own and was on most friendly terms with the pit. They were both as grotesque as the scenery, and that looked as if it had come out of a country booth. But Juliet! Harry, imagine a girl hardly 17 years of age, with a little flower-like face, a small Greek head with plaited coils of dark brown hair, eyes that were violet wells of passion, lips that were like the petals of a rose. She was the loveliest thing I had ever seen in my life. You said to me once that pathos left you unmoved, but that beauty, mere beauty, could fill your eyes with tears. I tell you, Harry, I could hardly see this girl for the mist of tears that came across me. And her voice! I'd never heard such a voice. It was very low at first, with deep, mellow tones that seemed to fall singly upon one's ear. Then it became a little louder, and sounded like a flute, or a distant hot boy's. In the garden scene, it had all the tremulous ecstasy that one hears just before dawn when nightingales are singing. There were moments later on when it had the wild passion of violins. You know how a voice can stir one. Your voice and the voice of Sybil Vane are two things that I shall never forget. When I close my eyes, I hear them, and each of them says something different. I don't know which to follow. Why should I not love her? Harry, I do love her. She's everything to me in life. Night after night I go to see her play. One evening she is Rosalind, and the next evening she is Imogen. I have seen her die in the gloom of an Italian tomb, sucking the poison from her lover's lips. I have watched her wandering through the forest of Arden, disguised as a pretty boy in hose and doublet and dainty cap. She has been mad, and has come into the presence of a guilty king, and given him rue to wear and bitter herbs to taste of. She has been innocent, and the black hands of jealousy have crushed her reed-like throat. I have seen her in every age and in every costume. Ordinary women never appeal to one's imagination. They are limited to their century. No glamour ever transfigures them. One knows their minds as easily as one knows their bonnets. One can always find them. There is no mystery in any of them. They ride in the park in the morning and chatter at tea parties in the afternoon. They have their stereotyped smile and their fashionable manner. They are quite obvious. But an actress! How different an actress is! Harry, why didn't you tell me that the only thing worth loving is an actress? Because I have loved so many of them, Dorian. Oh, yes, horrid people with dyed hair and painted faces. Don't run down dyed hair and painted faces. There is an extraordinary charm in them. Sometimes, said Lord Henry. I wish now I had not told you about Sybil Vane. You could not have helped telling me, Dorian. All through your life you will tell me everything you do. Yes, Harry, I believe that is true. I cannot help telling you things. You have a curious influence over me. If I ever did a crime, I would come and confess it to you. You would understand me. People like you, the willful sunbeams of life, don't commit crimes, Dorian. But I am much obliged for the compliment all the same. And now tell me, reach me the matches like a good boy. Thanks. What are your actual relations with Sybil Vane? Dorian Gray leapt to his feet, with flushed cheeks and burning eyes. Harry! Sybil Vane is sacred! It is only the sacred things that are worth touching, Dorian, said Lord Henry, with a strange touch of pathos in his voice. But why should you be annoyed? I suppose she will belong to you some day. When one is in love, one always begins by deceiving oneself, and one always ends by deceiving others. That is what the world calls a romance. You know her at any rate, I suppose? Of course I know her. On the first night I was at the theatre, the horrid old Jew came round to the box near the performance was over, and offered to take me behind the scenes and introduce me to her. I was furious with him and told him that Juliet had been dead for hundreds of years and that her body was lying in a marble tomb in Verona. I think from his blank look of amazement that he was under the impression that I had taken too much champagne or something. I'm not surprised. Then he asked me if I wrote for any of the newspapers. I told him I never even read them. He seemed terribly disappointed at that and confided to me that all the dramatic critics were in a conspiracy against him and that they were every one of them to be bought. I should not wonder if he was quite right there. But, on the other hand, judging from their appearance, most of them cannot be at all expensive. Well, he seemed to think they were beyond his means, laughed Dorian. By this time, however, the lights were being put out in the theatre, and I had to go. He wanted me to try some cigars that he strongly recommended. I declined. The next night, of course, I arrived at the place again. When he saw me, he made a low bow and assured me that I was a munificent patron of art. He was a most offensive brute, though he had an extraordinary passion for Shakespeare. He told me once, with an air of pride, that his 5 bankruptcies were entirely due to the Bard, as he insisted on calling him. He seemed to think it a distinction. It was a distinction, my dear Dorian, a great distinction. Most people become bankrupt through having invested too heavily in the prose of life. To have ruined oneself over poetry is an honor. But when did you first speak to Miss Sybil Vane? The third night she had been playing Rosalind. I could not help going round. I had thrown her some flowers, and she had looked at me. At least I fancied that she had. The old Jew was persistent. He seemed determined to take me behind, so I consented. It was curious, my not wanting to know her, wasn't it? No, I don't think so. My dear Harry, why? I will tell you some other time. Now I want to know about the girl. Sybil? Oh, she was so shy and so gentle. There was something of a child about her. Her eyes opened wide in exquisite wonder when I told her what I thought of her performance, and she seemed quite unconscious of her power. I think we were both rather nervous. The old Jew stood grinning at the doorway of the dusty green room, making elaborate speeches about us both, while we stood looking at each other like children. He would insist on calling me my lord, so I had to assure Sybil that I was not anything of the kind. She said quite simply to me, "You look more like a prince. I must call you Prince Charming." Upon my word, Dorian, Miss Sybil knows how to pay compliments. You don't understand her, Harry. She regarded me merely as a person in a play. She knows nothing of life. She lives with her mother, a faded, tired woman who played Lady Capulet in a sort of magenta dressing wrapper on the first night, and looks as if she had seen better days. I know that look. It depresses me, murmured Lord Henry, examining his rings. The Jew wanted to tell me her history, but I said it did not interest me. You were quite right. There is always something infinitely mean about other people's tragedies. Sybil is the only thing I care about. What is it to me where she came from? From her little head to her little feet, she is absolutely and entirely divine. Every night of my life I go to see her act, and every night she is more marvelous. That is the reason, I suppose, that you never dine out with me now. I thought you must have some curious romance on hand. You have, but it's not quite what I expected. My dear Harry, we either lunch or sup together every day, and I have been to the opera with you several times, said Dorian, opening his blue eyes in wonder. You always come dreadfully late. Well, I can't help going to see Sybil play, he cried. Even if it is only for a single act, I get hungry for her presence, and when I think of the wonderful soul that is hidden away in that little ivory body, I am filled with awe. You can dine with me tonight, Dorian, can't you? He shook his head. Tonight she is Imogen, he answered, and tomorrow night she will be Juliet. When is she Sybil Vane? Never. I congratulate you. How horrid you are! She is all the great heroines of the world in one. She is more than an individual. You laugh, but I tell you she has genius. I love her, and I must make her love me. You, who know all the secrets of life, tell me how to charm Sybil Vane to love me. I want to make Romeo jealous. I want the dead lovers of the world to hear our laughter and grow sad. I want a breath of our passion to stir their dust into consciousness, to wake their ashes into pain. My God, Harry, how I worship her! He was walking up and down the room as he spoke. Hectic spots of red burned on his cheeks. He was terribly excited. Lord Henry watched him with a subtle sense of pleasure. How different he was now from the shy, frightened boy he had met in Basil Hallward's studio. His nature had developed like a flower, had borne blossoms of scarlet flame. Out of its secret hiding-place had crept his soul, and desire had come to meet it on the way. "And what do you propose to do?" said Lord Henry at last. "I want you and Basil to come with me some night and see her act. I have not the slightest fear of the result. You are certain to acknowledge her genius. Then we must get her out of the Jew's hands. She is bound to him for 3 years, at least for 2 years and 8 months, from the present time. I shall have to pay him something, of course. When all that is settled, I shall take a West End theatre and bring her out properly. She will make the world as mad as she has made me." "That would be impossible, my dear boy." "Yes, she will. She has not merely consummate art instinct in her, but she has personality also, and you have often told me that it is personalities, not principles, that move the age." "Well, what night shall we go? Let me see. Today's Tuesday. Let us fix tomorrow. She plays Juliet tomorrow." "All right. The Bristol at 8 o'clock, and I will get Basil." "Not 8, Harry, please. 6:30. We must be there before the curtain rises. You must see her in the first act where she meets Romeo." 6:30? What an hour! It will be like having a meat tea or reading an English novel. It must be 7. No gentleman dines before 7. Shall you see Basil between this and then, or shall I write to him?" "Dear Basil! I have not laid eyes on him for a week. It's rather horrid of me, as he has sent me my portrait in the most wonderful frame, specially designed by himself, and though I am a little jealous of the picture for being a whole month younger than I am, I must admit that I delight in it. Perhaps you had better write to him. I don't want to see him alone. He says things that annoy me. He gives me good advice." Lord Henry smiled. "People are very fond of giving away what they need most themselves. It is what I call the depth of generosity. Oh, Basil is the best of fellows, but he seems to me to be just a bit of a Philistine. Since I have known you, Harry, I have discovered that. Basil, my dear boy, puts everything that is charming in him into his work. The consequence is that he has nothing left for life but his prejudices, his principles, and his common sense. The only artists I have ever known who are personally delightful are bad artists. Good artists exist simply in what they make, and consequently are perfectly uninteresting in what they are. A great poet, a really great poet, is the most unpoetical of all creatures. But inferior poets are absolutely fascinating. The worse their rhymes are, the more picturesque they look. The mere fact of having published a book of second-rate sonnets makes a man quite irresistible. He lives the poetry that he cannot write. The others write the poetry that they dare not realize." "I wonder, is that really so, Harry?" said Dorian Gray, putting some perfume on his handkerchief out of a large gold-topped bottle that stood on the table. "It must be if you say it. And now I'm off. Imogen is waiting for me. Don't forget about tomorrow. Goodbye." As he left the room, Lord Henry's heavy eyelids drooped, and he began to think. Certainly few people had ever interested him so much as Dorian Gray, and yet the lad's mad adoration of someone else caused him not the slightest pang of annoyance or jealousy. He was pleased by it. It made him a more interesting study. He had been always enthralled by the methods of natural science, but the ordinary subject matter of that science had seemed to him trivial and of no import, and so he had begun by vivisecting himself, as he had ended by vivisecting others. Human life, that appeared to him the one thing worth investigating. Compared to it, there was nothing else of any value. It was true that as one watched life in its curious crucible of pain and pleasure, one could not wear over one's face a mask of glass, nor keep the sulphurous fumes from troubling the brain, and making the imagination turbid with monstrous fancies and misshapen dreams. There were poisons so subtle that to know their properties one had to sicken of them. There were maladies so strange that one had to pass through them if one sought to understand their nature. And yet what a great reward one received! How wonderful the whole world became to one, to note the curious hard logic of passion and the emotional colored life of the intellect, to observe where they met and where they separated, at what point they were in unison, and at what point they were at discord. There was a delight in that. What matter what the cost was? One could never pay too high a price for any sensation. He was conscious, and the thought brought a gleam of pleasure into his brown, agate eyes, that it was through certain words of his, musical words said with musical utterance, that Dorian Gray's soul had turned to this white girl and bowed in worship before her. To a large extent, the lad was his own creation. He had made him premature. That was something. Ordinary people waited till life disclosed to them its secrets, but to the few, to the elect, the mysteries of life were revealed before the veil was drawn away. Sometimes this was the effect of art, and chiefly of the literature, which dealt immediately with the passions and the intellect. But now and then a complex personality took the place and assumed the office of art. Was indeed, in its way, a real work of art, life having its elaborate masterpieces just as poetry has, or sculpture, or painting. Yes, the lad was premature. He was gathering his harvest while it was yet spring. The pulse and passion of youth were in him, but he was becoming self-conscious. It was delightful to watch him. With his beautiful face and his beautiful soul, he was a thing to wonder at. It was, no matter how it all ended, or was destined to end. He was like one of those gracious figures in a pageant or a play, whose joys seem to be remote from one, but whose sorrows stir one's sense of beauty, and whose wounds are like red roses. Soul and body, body and soul. How mysterious they were! There was animalism in the soul, and the body had its moments of spirituality. The senses could refine, and the intellect could degrade. Who could say where the flesh impulse ceased, or the physical impulse began? How shallow were the arbitrary definitions of ordinary psychologists, and yet how difficult to decide between the claims of the various schools. Was the soul a shadow seated in the house of sin, or was the body really in the soul, as Giordano Bruno thought? The separation of spirit from matter was a mystery, and the union of spirit with matter was a mystery also. He began to wonder whether we could ever make psychology so absolute a science that each little spring of life would be revealed to us. As it was, we always misunderstood ourselves and rarely understood others. Experience was of no ethical value, it was merely the name men gave to their mistakes. Moralists had, as a rule, regarded it as a mode of warning, had claimed for it a certain ethical efficacy in the formation of character, had praised it as something that taught us what to follow and showed us what to avoid. But there was no motive power in experience. It was as little of an active cause as conscience itself. All that it really demonstrated was that our future would be the same as our past, and that the sin we had done once, and with loathing, we would do many times and with joy. It was clear to him that the experimental method was the only method by which one could arrive at any scientific analysis of the passions, and certainly Dorian Gray was a subject made to his hand, and seemed to promise rich and fruitful results. His sudden mad love for Sybil Vane was a psychological phenomenon of no small interest. There was no doubt that curiosity had much to do with it. Curiosity and the desire for new experiences. Yet it was not a simple, but rather a very complex passion. What there was in it of the purely sensuous instinct of boyhood had been transformed by the workings of the imagination, changed into something that seemed to the lad himself to be remote from sense, and was for that very reason all the more dangerous. It was the passions about whose origin we deceived ourselves that tyrannized most strongly over us. Our weakest motives were those of whose nature we were conscious. It often happened that, when we thought we were experimenting on others, we were really experimenting on ourselves. While Lord Henry sat dreaming on these things, a knock came to the door, and his valet entered, and reminded him it was time to dress for dinner. He got up and looked out into the street. The sunset had smitten into scarlet gold the upper windows of the houses opposite. The panes glowed like plates of heated metal. The sky above was a faded rose. He thought of his friend's young, fiery-colored life, and wondered how it was all going to end. When he arrived home, about 12:30, he saw a telegram lying on the hall table. He opened it and found it was from Dorian Gray. It was to tell him that he was engaged to be married to Sybil Vane. And that is the end of chapter 4. I straight up forgot that was a thing that happened in this book. Jury, I hope I pronounced that right. Cheers. The boy done moves fast, doesn't he? The boy done been in love, did. And there you go. I personally find Lord Henry such an interesting character, although I don't really like him very much. But I find him a very interesting character thus far. Again, I don't really remember what happens in the end of the book, so who knows whether I'll end up liking him more. But he's so weird. So Dorian is very easily influenced? Yes. What Basil was saying in chapter 1 was that Dorian is like a pure flower, untarnished by any of the pains or joys of life, and that's why he told Lord Henry not to corrupt him. Now Lord Henry comes out here with all of his beautiful words and his proclamations about things in life, as you guys have seen with his proclamations about women and how awful they are. He just likes to proclaim things about life and to insist that life is one way or the other, and Dorian drinks it all up and believes it all because Lord Henry has a beautiful voice, and that is why. Sybil was the only thing you remembered about the book? Oh, interesting. I remember the name Sybil Vane, and that she was an actress, but I really don't remember anything more, so I'm very curious about... Again, I just know the one thing about this book that I can't talk about because it hasn't started happening yet, and that's it. But, Dorian drank that shit up like me with a McDonald's milkshake! Oh yeah, that boy... See, here's the thing about Lord Henry. Because you meet his type all the time in life, and you meet his type especially if you're in college doing an English degree. And his type is this type of, like, young, pretty much always white, and also pretty much always male in my experience, person who is like, oh my god, I have all of life figured out. I am smarter than all of you. Let me say my grand, clever proclamations about how the world definitely, definitely is, and break everything down into easily consumable, witty little chunks about how I know the truth of the world. The thing that makes those kinds of people insufferable in college is that, like, I'm like a brown LGBT lady, and I'm like listening to these straight white guys talk about how they know everything about life, and I'm like, y'all don't know crap. But Lord Henry is clearly, Lord Henry's in his little bubble, and Lord Henry is even more especially, I think, what chapter 3 was trying to show us by showing him like engaging at a social outing, was to show us that Lord Henry is very witty, like he's very good at speaking, but that doesn't necessarily mean that he is smart or correct about any of the things that he say. It says in chapter 3, he used his wit basically to talk a bunch of really rich people out of investing in the poor people in their neighborhood. So, like, because he was just so witty, and he's like, oh, the poor will always blah, 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 blah. And they're like, you're right, it's pointless. We should all be having fun, and who cares about moralisms? Lord Henry is very aware of what he sees, but does not understand anything. Lord Henry likes boiling things down to oversimplifications, and Dorian is just drinking it up. And the, like, most upsetting thing about Lord Henry is that he's just, like, sitting here being like, I guess I don't care enough about Dorian to be jealous. In fact, I don't think that this, like, it's, or at least I read, I'm reaching here, but, like, to me, when I read that, it seems like he feels Dorian's experiences aren't going to end well, but that he's totally fine with it because he doesn't care, and he's like enacting a scientific experiment on Dorian, and he wants to see what's going to happen, and he doesn't actually care about like Dorian finding happiness in life. He just wants to see what's going to happen. He's like, Dorian's doing this too fast. Oh well, let's see what happens. And he's like, Dorian's doing this too fast because of me. Oh well, let's yeah, they're all at university. I don't know why. They're all at college. But hasn't named the rat in the maze. Also, though, can I just point out the, like, incredible obliviousness that he had? He's sitting there, like, musing about, like, psychology and all the truths, these grand truths of life. And then he says, it often happened that when we thought we were experimenting on others, we were really experimenting on ourselves, and has no self-awareness about this at all. He's just like, oh, people often think that they're experimenting on others when they're experimenting on themselves. Anyway, pip pip, I'm off to see how Dorian figures out his, like, come on, dude, you're he's like, it's fine. He's just such a I've read this book, and I've, like, talked to some people, and they're like, Lord Henry is so wise and witty, and I'm like, you are missing the point of his character. It's fine. At least in my interpretation. This is my interpretation of Lord Henry. You guys don't have to interpret him in the same way. Because when they leave, reality hits them like a truck. That's fair. That's fair. And that's why I think they're so frustrating to people who have experienced some more of the realities of life in that way, because it's just like so apparent that they are inexperienced and I feel like that's why it tends to be white straight men who have this kind of perspective, is because like you only get to feel like you have all of life figured out if life hasn't presented any strange complications to you, and especially if life hasn't presented any strange complications to you in which you are powerless to stop the unfairness of like an unjust system. So I feel like it tends to be, but is not always, that people who have more experience of this, whether like they've had a hard life, they grew up in poverty, they experienced illness, they are a person of color, they are a lady, they are LGBT, they're non-binary, like those people tend to like look at these men in university and be like, boy, you sure do think you have everything figured out, because your life has definitely been one way since you came of age and like you haven't yet had any of those experiences that of like what life actually can be like yet, because you've just had your nice, there's just some people who like have not yet had super negative experiences yet. Something bootstrap something. Why he didn't do anything? You feel like Lord Henry doesn't care about people, he just uses them or sees them as pieces of a game. You don't like these types of characters/people, they're one-dimensional. I disagree. I don't think that Lord Henry is one-dimensional. But I do see your point about Lord Henry not caring about people or seeing them or using them as pieces of a game. These people are definitely not one-dimensional. They I'm like I don't know what word I would use for them instead. He has depth. He's just not a character that you enjoy. Yeah. He has a lot of depth. He definitely, like, we've already seen, like, you could really do a deep dive psychoanalyzation into this guy, especially with the perspective that Basil provides, where he's like, Henry, you keep saying these things, and I don't believe that you believe any of the things that you say. And so, like, the perspective we get on Lord Henry in Chapter 1, I feel like, is very important to having a foundational understanding of Lord Henry, and to cluing us in that even though he presents himself as, like, this font of knowledge about the truths of life, he's actually just spouting off stuff that he doesn't truly believe in. I think that's why the book starts off with Chapter 1, because if you were introduced to Henry without Lord Basil contextualizing him, then you might be too taken in by his witticisms, in my head. Sometimes it's easier to pontificate and bluster than to actually face your shortcomings. But Icarus is a teenager. As soon as they get flying, he does that thing where he thinks he's immortal because he hasn't been alive long enough for anything really bad to happen to him, so he starts flying higher and higher. Icarus, yeah. Man, I've been reflecting on, like, how invulnerable I definitely felt when I was a teenager, and I'm like, you definitely, that invulnerability definitely helps make change in the world when harnessed and used in the best way. He's talking out of his ass because he doesn't actually know anything. I don't know how much he does and doesn't know. I don't know that he cares about whether what he says is true. I think he only cares about whether it sounds pretty. Like, I don't know. I don't have my finger on him. I'm just, like, deeply suspicious about this guy. I don't know. We can all, like, come to our own conclusions about, like, what the hell Lord Henry, like, what's driving him. I don't know. I just kind of feel like he's, like, a deeply unsatisfied person in life. And so his only, like, way to feel better about that is to claim that he knows the truth of everything and everybody else is an utter fool, and who knows. Sometimes it's easier to try to make up reasons for things than to do difficult self-work to make yourself the person you would then be obliged to consider better. Oh, is that what that is? Is that what that is? What would you say is the impulse for that kind of thing, Chase? Like, is that just, like... Because, like, my first impulse is to be like, oh, that must be because of, like, laziness and defensiveness, but I'm not actually sure if it is because of laziness and defensiveness. I've never quite, as a quadruple threat minority, I'm always like, I need to be better all of the time, especially if I want to achieve anything in my life. So I'm just like, I have to always be doing better. So it's interesting that, like, white males get to be like, I don't want to be better right now. And, like, they don't need to be, because we don't, like, as a society, we don't hold them as accountable as we do other people. It's work to change, and it means accepting that you're wrong or need to improve. Okay, so it's just... I can't think of a way to phrase this gently. Because, like, to me, and again, I'm not trying to say this to be like, you're dumb. Or not you specifically, but like, people who do this are dumb, but like that does seem to me to be a kind of childishness of like not like literally being like not concluding that like I don't know, not taking responsibilities on as like a person in the world for needing to be a better person in the world to other people, and like the childishness of being like, well, I don't like that's tiring and I don't need to change if I don't want to because that kind of thing. Oh, thank you, Zareka. The main thing that's happening in this book is that Dorian is now in love with Sybil Vane, and Dorian is friends with Lord Henry and Basil the painter, and Basil painted a picture of Dorian Gray in his immortalized youth. Those are like the main broad strokes that you need to know. We really haven't like gotten too far. Not like a lot has happened. A lot more has been described, like Lord Henry's personality has been described and illustrated, but not much like plot movement has happened just yet. It's sheltering yourself from the need to change and improve. I guess that's why we call it male privilege, or I guess the intersection of white male privilege, and usually, to be honest, the intersection of white male healthy middle class privilege or upper class privilege, because generally when you're like, I don't know, I feel like if you start off with less power and you're trying to go like move upward in life, you just have to work so much harder and you have to be so much better than, you know, the straight white male average, that like you just have to embrace working on yourself. But maybe I'm wrong. I don't know. I don't have the experience. I only have my own lived experience. I don't fully understand the experience of the other situation. If you don't have to change, it's easier not to. There's little impetus to do so. And that's why we need to hold people accountable for their bad behavior, to give them incentive. Otherwise, they won't do it. That's why accountability and responsibility for things are so important in a culture, to engender into a culture. Which is not the same thing as not letting people make mistakes. Let's be clear here. People are allowed to make mistakes. It's just that it's important for them to like learn from them and take responsibility for them when they do and become better people. And we need to give people that chance to do so, depending on the crime. You either have to have a strong moral system or consequences, yeah. So it's a policy issue. Interesting. Chase, thank you for sharing. I know that kind of thing can be kind of like, can be hard to talk about. You know, it can be hard to talk about since it opens yourself up for the upset of many people who have just been watching. Oh my god. Sorry, it's fine. I just had like an intense flashback to like a former colleague of mine who was so not qualified for the position that he got. It's fine. It's fine. It's fine. Come back, Cara. Come back. It's not happening anymore. You're not perfect at all. None of us are. I'm not perfect at all either. My brain sure doesn't let me forget it. Okay, anyways. So we will be Lord Henry. He's not ignorant or arrogant. He's slightly lazy, but more non-committal. Oh, Lord Henry? Oh yeah, Lord Henry doesn't commit to literally anything. He's like too afraid to commit. Well, I'm not sure if he is too afraid to commit. He strikes me as a person who is too afraid to commit to anything. Because it's much easier to be a scientist and observe life. And he's like, I'm not jealous of Sybil Vane and Dorian Gray. No, I'm just observing them, actually. Okay, so, chapter 5. Mother, I'm so happy, whispered the girl, burying her face in the lap of the faded, tired-looking woman who, with back turned to the shrill, intrusive light, was sitting in the one armchair that their dingy sitting room contained. I'm so happy, she repeated, and you must be happy too. Mrs. Vane winced and put her thin, bismuth-whitened hands on her daughter's head. Happy, she echoed. I'm only happy, Sybil, when I see you act. You must not think of anything but your acting. Mr. Isaacs has been very good to us. and we owe him money." The girl looked up and pouted. "Money, mother," she cried. "What does money matter? Love is more than money." "Mr. Isaacs has advanced us £50 to pay off our debts, and to get a proper outfit for James. You must not forget that, Sybil. £50 is a very large sum. Mr. Isaacs has been most considerate." "He is not a gentleman, mother, and I hate the way he talks to me," said the girl, rising to her feet and going over to the window. Yeah, that's a valid interpretation, Chase. Yeah. I see that. "I don't know how we could manage without him," answered the elder woman querulously. Sybil Vane tossed her head and laughed. "We don't want him any more, mother. Prince Charming rules life for us now." Then she paused. A rose shook in her blood and shadowed her cheeks. Quick breath parted the petals of her lips. They trembled. Some southern wind of passion swept over her and stirred the dainty folds of her dress. "I love him," she said simply. "Foolish child! Foolish child!" was the parrot phrase flung in response. The waving of crooked, false-jeweled fingers gave grotesqueness to the words. The girl laughed again. The joy of a caged bird was in her voice. Her eyes caught the melody and echoed it in radiance, then closed for a moment as though to hide their secret. When they opened, the mist of a dream had passed across them. Thin-lipped wisdom spoke at her from the worn chair, hinted at prudence, quoted from that book of cowardice whose author apes the name of common sense. She did not listen. She was free in her prison of passion. Her prince, Prince Charming, was with her. She had called on memory to remake him. She had sent her soul to search for him, and it had brought him back. His kiss burned again upon her mouth. Her eyelids were warm with his breath. Then wisdom altered its method and spoke of espial and discovery. This young man might be rich. If so, marriage should be thought of. Against the shell of her ear broke the waves of worldly cunning. The arrows of craft shot by her. She saw the thin lips moving, and smiled. Suddenly she felt the need to speak. The wordy silence troubled her. "Mother, mother!" she cried. "Why does he love me so much? I know why I love him. I love him because he is like what love himself should be. But what does he see in me? I'm not worthy of him. And yet, why, I cannot tell. Though I feel so much beneath him, I don't feel humble. I feel proud, terribly proud. Mother, did you love my father as I love Prince Charming?" The elder woman grew pale beneath the coarse powder that daubed her cheeks, and her dry lips twitched with a spasm of pain. Sybil rushed to her, flung her arms around her neck, and kissed her. "Forgive me, mother. I know it pains you to talk about our father. But it only pains you because you loved him so much. Don't look so sad. I'm as happy today as you were 20 years ago. Ah, let me be happy forever." "My child, you are far too young to think of falling in love. Besides, what do you know of this young man? You don't even know his name. The whole thing is most inconvenient, and really, when James is going away to Australia and I have so much to think of, I must say that you should have shown more consideration. However, as I said before, if he is rich—" "Ah, mother, mother, let me be happy!" Mrs. Vane glanced at her, and with one of those false theatrical gestures that so often become a mode of second nature to a stage player, clasped her in her arms. At this moment the door opened, and a young lad with rough brown hair came into the room. He was thick-set of figure, and his hands and feet were large and somewhat clumsy in movement. He was not so finely bred as his sister. One would hardly have guessed the close relationship that existed between them. Mrs. Vane fixed her eyes on him and intensified the smile. She mentally elevated her son to the dignity of an audience. She felt sure that the tableau was interesting. "You might keep some of your kisses for me, Sybil, I think," said the lad, with a good-natured grumble. "Ah, but you don't like being kissed, Jim," she cried. "You are a dreadful old bear." And she ran across the room and hugged him. James Vane looked into his sister's face with tenderness. "I want you to come out with me for a walk, Sybil. I don't suppose I shall ever see this horrid London again. I'm sure I don't want to." "My son, don't say such dreadful things," murmured Mrs. Vane, taking up a tawdry theatrical dress with a sigh and beginning to patch it. She felt a little disappointed that he had not joined the group. It would have increased the theatrical picturesqueness of the situation. Why not, mother? I mean it. You pain me, my son. I trust you will return from Australia in a position of affluence. I believe there is no society of any kind in the colonies, nothing that I would call society. So when you have made your fortune, you must come back and assert yourself in London. Society, muttered the lad. I don't want to know anything about that. I should like to make some money to take you and Sybil off the stage. I hate it. Oh, Jim, said Sybil, laughing. How unkind of you! But are you really going for a walk with me? That will be nice. I was afraid you were going to say goodbye to some of your friends, to Tom Hardy, who gave you that hideous pipe, or Ned Langton, who makes fun of you for smoking it. It is very sweet of you to let me have your last afternoon. Where shall we go? Let us go to the park. I'm too shabby, he answered, frowning. Only swell people go to the park. Nonsense, Jim, she whispered, stroking the sleeve of his coat. He hesitated for a moment. Very well, he said at last, but don't be too long dressing. She danced out of the door. One could hear her singing as she ran upstairs. Her little feet pattered overhead. He walked up and down the room 2 or 3 times. Then he turned to the figure still in the chair. Mother, are my things ready? He asked. Quite ready, James, she answered, keeping her eyes on her work. For some months past she had felt ill at ease when she was alone with this rough, stern son of hers. Her shallow, secret nature was troubled when their eyes met. She used to wonder if he suspected anything. The silence, for he made no other observation, became intolerable to her. She began to complain. Women defend themselves by attacking, just as they attack by sudden and strange surrenders. I hope you will be contented, James, with your seafaring life, she said. You must remember that it is your own choice. You might have entered a solicitor's office. Solicitors are a very respectable class, and in the country often dine with the best families. I hate offices and I hate clerks, he replied, but you are quite right. I have chosen my own life. All I say is, watch over Sybil. Don't let her come to any harm. Mother, you must watch over her. James, you really talk very strangely. Of course I watch over Sybil. I hear a gentleman comes every night to the theatre and goes behind to talk to her. Is that right? What about that? You are speaking about things you don't understand, James. In the profession we are accustomed to receive a great deal of most gratifying attention. I myself used to receive many bouquets at one time. That was when acting was really understood. As for Sybil, I do not know at present whether her attachment is serious or not, but there is no doubt that the young man in question is a perfect gentleman. He is always most polite to me. Besides, he has the appearance of being rich, and the flowers he sends are lovely. You don't know his name, though, said the lad harshly. No, answered his mother, with a placid expression in her face. He has not yet revealed his name. I think it is quite romantic of him. He's probably a member of the aristocracy. James Vane bit his lip. Watch over Sybil, mother, he cried. Watch over her. My son, you distress me very much. Sybil is always under my special care. Of course, if this gentleman is wealthy, there is no reason why she should not contract an alliance with him. I trust he is one of the aristocracy. He has all the appearance of it, I must say. It might be a most brilliant marriage for Sybil. They would make a charming couple. His good looks are really quite remarkable. Everybody notices them. The lad muttered something to himself and drummed on the window-pane with his coarse fingers. He had just turned round to say something when the door opened and Sybil ran in. How serious you both are, she cried. What is the matter? Nothing, he answered. I suppose one must be serious sometimes. Good-bye, mother. I will have my dinner at 5 o'clock. Everything is packed except my shirts, so you need not trouble. Good-bye, my son, she answered with a bow of strained stateliness. She was extremely annoyed at the tone he had adopted with her, and there was something in his look that had made her feel afraid. Kiss me, mother, said the girl. Her flower-like lips touched the withered cheek and warmed its frost. My child, cried Mrs. Vane, looking up to the ceiling in search of an imaginary gallery. Come, Sybil, said her brother impatiently. He hated his mother's affectations. They went out into the flickering, wind-blown sunlight and strolled down the dreary Euston Road. The passers-by glanced in wonder at the sullen, heavy youth who, in coarse, ill-fitting clothes, was in the company of such a graceful, refined-looking girl. He was like a common gardener walking with a rose. Jim frowned from time to time when he caught the inquisitive glance of some stranger. He had that dislike of being stared at which comes on geniuses late in life and never leaves the commonplace. Sybil, however, was quite unconscious of the effect she was producing. Her love was trembling and laughter on her lips. She was thinking of Prince Charming, and, that she might think of him all the more, she did not talk of him, but prattled on about the ship in which Jim was going to sail, about the gold he was certain to find, about the wonderful heiress whose life he was to save from the wicked, red-shirted bushrangers. For he was not to remain a sailor or a supercargo or whatever he was going to be. Oh, no! A sailor's existence was dreadful. Fancy being cooped up in a horrid ship with the hoarse, hump-backed waves trying to get in, and a black wind blowing the masts down and tearing the sails into long, screaming ribbons. He was to leave the vessel at Melbourne, bid a polite good-bye to the captain, and go off at once to the gold fields. Before a week was over, he was to come across a large nugget of pure gold, the largest nugget that had ever been discovered, and bring it down to the coast in a wagon guarded by 6 mounted policemen. The bushrangers were to attack them 3 times and be defeated with immense slaughter. Or, no, he was not to go to the gold fields at all. They were horrid places where men got intoxicated and shot each other in bar-rooms and used bad language. He was to be a nice sheep farmer, and one evening, as he was riding home, he was to see the beautiful heiress being carried off by a robber on a black horse, and give chase and rescue her. Of course she would fall in love with him, and he with her, and they would get married and come home and live in an immense house in London. Yes, there were delightful things in store for him, but he must be very good and not lose his temper, or spend his money foolishly. She was only a year older than he was, but she knew so much more of life. He must be sure also to write to her by every mail, and to say his prayers each night before he went to sleep. God was very good, and would watch over him. She would pray for him too, and in a few years he could come back quite rich and happy. The lad listened sulkily to her, and made no answer. He was heartsick at leaving home. Yet it was not this alone that made him gloomy and morose. Inexperienced though he was, he had still a strong sense of the danger of Sybil's position. This young dandy who was making love to her could mean her no good. He was a gentleman, and he hated him for that, hated him through some curious race instinct for which he could not account, and which for that reason was all the more dominant within him. He was conscious also of the shallowness and vanity of his mother's nature, and in that saw infinite peril for Sybil and Sybil's happiness. Children begin by loving their parents. As they grow older they judge them. Sometimes they forgive them. His mother! He had something on his mind to ask of her, something that he had brooded on for many months of silence. A chance phrase that he had heard at the theatre, a whispered sneer that had reached his ears one night as he waited at the stage door, had set loose a train of horrible thoughts. He remembered it as if it had been the lash of a hunting crop across his face. His brows knit together into a wedge-like furrow, and with a twitch of pain he bit his under lip. "You're not listening to a word I'm saying, Jim," cried Sybil, "and I'm making the most delightful plans for your future. Do say something." "What do you want me to say?" "Oh, that you will be a good boy, and not forget us," she answered, smiling at him. He shrugged his shoulders. "You are more likely to forget me than I am to forget you, Sybil." She flushed. "What do you mean, Jim?" she asked. "You have a new friend, I hear. Who is he? Why have you not told me about him? He means you no good." "Stop, Jim," she exclaimed. "You must not say anything against him. I love him." "What? You don't even know his name," answered the lad. "Who is he? I have a right to know." "He is called Prince Charming. Don't you like the name?" "Oh, you silly boy, you should never forget it. If you only saw him, you would think him the most wonderful person in the world. Some day you will meet him. When you come back from Australia, you will like him so much. Everybody likes him, and I love him. I wish you could come to the theatre tonight. He's going to be there, and I am to play Juliet. Oh, how I shall play it! Fancy, Jim, to be in love and play Juliet, to have him sitting there, to play for his delight. I'm afraid I may frighten the company, frighten or enthrall them. To be in love is to surpass one's self. Poor dreadful Mr. Isaacs will be shouting 'Genius' to his loafers at the bar. He has preached me as a dogma. Tonight he will announce me as a revelation. I feel it. And it is all his only, Prince Charming, my wonderful lover, my god of graces. But I am poor beside him. Poor? What does that matter? When poverty creeps in at the door, love flies in through the window. Our proverbs want rewriting. They were made in winter, and it is summer now. Springtime for me, I think. A very dance of blossoms in the blue sky." "He is a gentleman," said the lad sullenly. "A prince!" she cried musically. "What more do you want?" "He wants to enslave you." "I shudder at the thought of being free." "I want you to beware of him. To see him is to worship him. To know him is to trust him." "Sybil, you're mad about him." She laughed and took his arm. "You dear old Jim, you talk as if you were 100. Some day you will be in love yourself. Then you will know what it is. Don't look so sulky. Surely you should be glad to think that, though you are going away, you leave me happier than I have ever been before. Life has been hard for us both, terribly hard and difficult. But it will be different now. You are going to a new world, and I have found one. Here are 2 chairs. Let us sit down and see the smart people go by." They took their seats amidst a crowd of watchers. The tulip beds across the road flamed like throbbing rings of fire. A white dust, tremulous cloud of orris root, it seemed, hung in the panting air. The brightly colored parasols danced and dipped like monstrous butterflies. She made her brother talk of himself, his hopes, his prospects. He spoke slowly and with effort. They passed words to each other as players at a game pass counters. Sybil felt oppressed. She could not communicate her joy. A faint smile curving that sullen mouth was all the echo she could win. After some time she became silent. Suddenly she caught a glimpse of golden hair and laughing lips, and in an open carriage with 2 ladies, Dorian Gray drove past. She started to her feet. "There he is!" she cried. "Who?" said Jim Fane. "Prince Charming," she answered, looking after the Victoria. He jumped up and seized her roughly by the arm. "Show him to me! Which is he? Point him out! I must see him!" he exclaimed. But at that moment the Duke of Berwick's 4-in-hand came between, and when it had left the space clear, the carriage had swept out of the park. "He's gone," murmured Sybil sadly. "I wish you had seen him." "I wish I had, for as sure as there is a God in heaven, if he ever does you any wrong, I shall kill him." She looked at him in horror. He repeated his words. They cut the air like a dagger. The people round began to gape. A lady standing close to her tittered. "Come away, Jim, come away," she whispered. He followed her doggedly as she passed through the crowd. He felt glad at what he had said. When they reached the Achilles statue, she turned round. There was pity in her eyes that became laughter on her lips. She shook her head at him. "You're foolish, Jim, utterly foolish. A bad-tempered boy, that's all. How can you say such horrible things? You don't know what you're talking about. You're simply jealous and unkind. I wish you could fall in love. Love makes people good, and what you said was wicked." "I am 16, he answered, "and I know what I'm about. Mother is no help to you. She doesn't understand how to look after you. I wish now that I was not going to Australia at all. I have a great mind to chuck the whole thing up. I would, if my articles hadn't been signed." Volumes, thanks for resubscribing. Welcome back to the fold. Congrats on being a baby. Oh, don't be so serious, Jim. You're like one of the heroes of those silly melodramas Mother used to be so fond of acting in. I'm not going to quarrel with you. I have seen him, and to see him is perfect happiness. We won't quarrel. I know you would never harm anyone I love. Would you? Not as long as you love him, I suppose, was the sullen answer. I shall love him forever, she cried. And he? Forever, too. He'd better. She shrank from him. Then she laughed and put her hand on his arm. He was merely a boy. At the Marble Arch they hailed an omnibus which left them close to their shabby home in the Euston Road. It was after 5 o'clock, and Sybil had to lie down for a couple of hours before acting. Jim insisted that she should do so. He said that he would sooner part with her when their mother was not present. She would be sure to make a scene, and he detested scenes of every kind. In Sybil's own room they parted. There was jealousy in the lad's heart, and a fierce, murderous hatred of the stranger who, as it seemed to him, had come between them. Yet when her arms were flung round his neck, and her fingers strayed through his hair, he softened, and kissed her with real affection. There were tears in his eyes as he went downstairs. His mother was waiting for him below. She grumbled at his unpunctuality as he entered. He made no answer, but sat down to his meagre meal. The flies buzzed round the table and crawled over the stained cloth. Through the rumble of omnibuses and the clatter of street cabs, he could hear the droning voice devouring each minute that was left to him. After some time he thrust away his plate, and put his head in his hands. He felt that he had a right to know. It should have been told to him before. if it was as he suspected. Leaden with fear, his mother watched him. Words dropped mechanically from her lips. A tattered lace handkerchief twitched in her fingers. When the clock struck 6, he got up and went to the door. Then he turned back and looked at her. Their eyes met. In hers he saw a wild appeal for mercy. It enraged him. "Mother, I have something to ask you," he said. Her eyes wandered vaguely about the room. She made no answer. "Tell me the truth. I have a right to know. Were you married to my father?" She heaved a deep sigh. It was a sigh of relief. The terrible moment, the moment that night and day for weeks and months she had dreaded, had come at last, and yet she felt no terror. Indeed, in some measure it was a disappointment to her. The vulgar directness of the question called for a direct answer. The situation had not been gradually led up to. It was crude. It reminded her of a bad rehearsal. "No," she answered, wondering at the harsh simplicity of life. "My father was a scoundrel, then?" cried the lad, clenching his fists. She shook her head. "I knew he was not free. We loved each other very much. If he had lived, he would have made provision for us. Don't speak against him, my son. He was your father and a gentleman. Indeed, he was highly connected." An oath broke from his lips. "I don't care for myself," he exclaimed, "but don't let Sybil—" "It is a gentleman, isn't it, who is in love with her, or says he is? Highly connected, too, I suppose." For a moment a hideous sense of humiliation came over the woman. Her head drooped. She wiped her eyes with shaking hands. "Sybil has a mother," she murmured. "I had none." The lad was touched. He went towards her, and stooping down, he kissed her. "I'm sorry if I have pained you by asking about my father," he said, "but I could not help it. I must go now. Goodbye. Don't forget that you will only have one child now to look after, and believe me that if this man wrongs my sister, I will find out who he is, track him down, and kill him like a dog. I swear it." The exaggerated folly of the threat, the passionate gesture that accompanied it, the mad melodramatic words made life seem more vivid to her. She was familiar with the atmosphere. She breathed more freely, and for the first time for many months she really admired her son. She would have liked to have continued the scene on the same emotional scale, but he cut her short. Trunks had to be carried down, and mufflers looked for. The lodging-house drudge bustled in and out. There was the bargaining with the cabman. The moment was lost in vulgar details. It was with a renewed feeling of disappointment that she waved the tattered lace handkerchief from the window as her son drove away. She was conscious that a great opportunity had been wasted. She consoled herself by telling Sybil how desolate she felt her life would be now that she only had one child to look after. She remembered the phrase. It had pleased her. Of the threat she said nothing. It was vividly and dramatically expressed. She felt that they would all laugh at it some day. And thus the end of chapter 5, where we learn a little bit more about Sybil and her family and their circumstances. Man, why are ladies in these old novels always portrayed as like running across the room to fling their arms on people and kiss their cheeks? Why is that a thing? That is a thing. It's a thing. I'm just like, did they actually act that way? I don't know. Oh, the first chapter you actually remembered. Okay. You remember that chapter. Interesting. I did not remember anything about it at all. I guess we shall find out, maybe, Cece, by the end of the book. Oh my god. We'll take a brief pause if anybody has any comments that they want to make about chapter 5 before we start on chapter 6. I hope you all brought some beverages with you. What kind of bevies you got? The same reason it happens in anime, you assume? Sybil is something. Water? Hey, water's better than nothing. I have the Jane Austen quote on here, on this. The person, be it gentleman or lady, who has not pleasure in a good novel must be intolerably stupid. Coppaberg, strawberry and lime. Oh, nice. Hey, Epic. Sybil certainly is something. I think maybe she's like supposed to be kind of similar to Dorian, who is also like so innocent and pure and like naive that she's just like, yeah, I think that's what I'll say. She's just supposed to be innocent and pure and naive. The new Dr. Pepper and cream soda? Oh, I didn't know that there was a new one. I'm so out of touch with sodas anymore. All right. If nobody has anything else to say, I will continue. Extreme hard water. That makes sense. Have you gotten a water filter for like your drinking water? I could see how that would make your eczema like a lot worse. Or no, sorry, not eczema, psoriasis. But yeah, I could see how that is a thing. A water softener for your shower will help. If your landlord is comfortable with it, you can always ask them about installing a filtration system for your apartment. Sometimes they say yes, sometimes they say no, but it's worth a try. All right. We go and continue on to chapter 6. I suppose you've heard the news, Basil, said Lord Henry that evening as Hallward was shown into a little private room at the Bristol where dinner had been laid for 3. No, Harry, answered the artist, giving his hat and coat to the bowing waiter. What is it? Nothing about politics, I hope. They don't interest me. There's hardly a single person in the House of Commons worth painting, though many of them would be the better for a little whitewashing. Dorian Gray is engaged to be married, said Lord Henry, watching him as he spoke. Hallward started, and then frowned. Dorian engaged to be married, he cried. Impossible! It is perfectly true. To whom? To some little actress or other. I can't believe it. Dorian is far too sensible. Dorian is far too wise not to do foolish things now and then, my dear Basil. Marriage is hardly a thing that one can do now and then, Harry. Except in America, rejoined Lord Henry languidly. But I didn't say he was married. I said he was engaged to be married. There's a great difference. I have a distinct remembrance of being married, but I have no recollection at all of being engaged. I'm inclined to think that I never was engaged. But think of Dorian's birth and position and wealth. It would be absurd for him to marry so much beneath him. If you want to make him marry this girl, tell him that, Basil. He is sure to do it then. Whenever a man does a thoroughly stupid thing, it is always from the noblest motives. I hope the girl is good, Harry. I don't want to see Dorian tied to some vile creature who might degrade his nature and ruin his intellect. Oh, she's better than good. She's beautiful, murmured Lord Henry, sipping a glass of vermouth and orange bitters. Dorian says she is beautiful, and he is not often wrong about things of that kind. Your portrait of him has quickened his appreciation of the personal appearance of other people. It has had that excellent effect amongst others. We are to see her tonight, if that boy doesn't forget his appointment. Are you serious? Quite serious, Basil. I should be miserable if I thought I should ever be more serious than I am at the present moment. But do you approve of it, Harry? Asked the painter, walking up and down the room and biting his lip. You can't approve of it, possibly. It's some silly infatuation. I never approve or disapprove of anything now. It is an absurd attitude to take towards life. We are not sent into the world to air moral prejudices. I never take any notice of what common people say, and I never interfere with what charming people do. If a personality fascinates me, whatever mode of expression that personality selects is absolutely delightful to me. Dorian Gray falls in love with a beautiful girl who acts Juliet and proposes to marry her. Why not? If he wedded Messalina, he would be none the less interesting. You know I'm not a champion of marriage. The real drawback to marriage is that it makes one unselfish, and unselfish people are colorless. They lack individuality. Still, there are certain temperaments that marriage makes more complex. They retain their egotism and add to it many other egos. They are forced to have more than one life. They become more highly organized, and to be highly organized is, I should fancy, the object of man's existence. Besides, every experience is of value, and whatever one may say against marriage, it is certainly an experience. I hope that Dorian Gray will make this girl his wife, passionately adore her for 6 months, and then suddenly become fascinated by someone else. He would be a wonderful study." "You don't mean a single word of all that, Harry. You know you don't. If Dorian Gray's life were spoiled, no one would be sorrier than yourself." "You're much better than you pretend to be." Lord Henry laughed. "The reason we all like to think so well of others is that we are all afraid for ourselves. The basis of optimism is sheer terror. We think that we are generous because we credit our neighbor with the possession of those virtues that are likely to be a benefit to us. We praise the banker that we may overdraw our account, and find good qualities in the highwayman in the hope that he may spare our pockets. I mean everything that I have said. I have the greatest contempt for optimism. As for a spoiled life, no life is spoiled but one whose growth is arrested. If you want to mar a nature, you have merely to reform it. As for marriage, of course, that would be silly, but there are other and more interesting bonds between men and women. I will certainly encourage them. They have the charm of being fashionable. But here is Dorian himself. He will tell you more than I can." "My dear Harry, my dear Basil, you must both congratulate me," said the lad, throwing off his evening cape with its satin-lined wings and shaking each of his friends by the hand in turn. "I have never been so happy. Of course it is sudden. All really delightful things are. And yet it seems to me to be the one thing I have been looking for all my life." He was flushed with excitement and pleasure, and looked extraordinarily handsome. "I hope you will always be very happy, Dorian," said Hallward, "but I don't quite forgive you for not having let me know of your engagement." "You let Harry know." "And I don't forgive you for being late and I don't forgive you for being late for dinner," broke in Lord Henry, putting his hand on the lad's shoulder and smiling as he spoke. "Come, let us sit down and try what the new chef here is like, and then you will tell us how it all came about." "There is really not much to tell," cried Dorian, as they took their seats at the small round table. "What happened was simply this. After I left you yesterday evening, Harry, I dressed, had some dinner at that little Italian restaurant in Rupert Street you introduced me to, and went down at 8 o'clock to the theatre. Sybil was playing Rosalind. Of course the scenery was dreadful, and the Orlando absurd, but Sybil, you should have seen her. When she came on in her boy's clothes, she was perfectly wonderful. She wore a moss-colored velvet jerkin with cinnamon sleeves, slim brown cross-gartered hose, a dainty little green cap with a hawk's feather caught in the jewel, and a hooded cloak lined with dull red. She had never seemed to me more exquisite. She had all the delicate grace of that Tanagra figurine that you have in your studio, Basil. Her hair clustered round her face like dark leaves round a pale rose. As for her acting, well, you shall see her tonight. She is simply a born artist. I sat in the dingy box absolutely enthralled. I forgot that I was in London and in the 19th century. I was away with my love in a forest that no man had ever seen. After the performance was over, I went behind and spoke to her. As we were sitting together, suddenly there came into her eyes a look that I had never seen there before. My lips moved towards hers. We kissed each other. I can't describe to you what I felt at that moment. It seemed to me that all my life had been narrowed to one perfect point of rose-colored joy. She trembled all over and shook like a white narcissus. Then she flung herself on her knees and kissed my hands. I feel that I should not tell you all this, but I can't help it. Of course our engagement is a dead secret. She has not even told her own mother. I don't know what my guardians will say. Lord Radley is sure to be furious. I don't care. I shall be of age in less than a year, and then I can do what I like. I have been right, Basil, haven't I, to take my love out of poetry, and to find my wife in Shakespeare's plays? Lips that Shakespeare taught to speak have whispered their secret in my ear. I have had the arms of Rosalind around me, and kissed Juliet on the mouth. Yes, Dorian, I suppose you were right, said Hallward slowly. Have you seen her today? Asked Lord Henry. Dorian Gray shook his head. I left her in the forest of Arden. I shall find her in an orchard in Verona. Lord Henry sipped his champagne in a meditative manner. At what particular point did you mention the word marriage, Dorian? And what did she say in answer? Perhaps you forgot all about it. My dear Harry, I did not treat it as a business transaction, and I did not make any formal proposal. I told her that I loved her, and she said she was not worthy to be my wife. Not worthy? Why, the whole world is nothing to me compared with her. Women are wonderfully practical, murmured Lord Henry. Much more practical than we are. In situations of that kind, we often forget to say anything about marriage, and they always remind us. Hallward laid his hand upon his arm. Don't, Harry. You have annoyed Dorian. He is not like other men. He would never bring misery upon anyone. His nature is too fine for that. Lord Henry looked across the table. Dorian is never annoyed with me, he answered. I asked the question for the best reason possible, for the only reason indeed that excuses one for asking any question, simple curiosity. I have a theory that it is always the women who propose to us, and not we who propose to the women. Of course, except in middle-class life, but then the middle classes are not modern. Dorian Gray laughed and tossed his head. You are quite incorrigible, Harry, but I don't mind. It is impossible to be angry with you. When you see Sybil Vane, you will feel that the man who could wrong her would be a beast without a heart. I cannot understand how anyone can wish to shame the thing he loves. I love Sybil Vane. I want to place her on a pedestal of gold, and to see the world worship the woman who is mine. What is marriage? An irrevocable vow. You mock at it for that. Oh, don't mock. It is an irrevocable vow that I want to take. Her trust makes me faithful. Her belief makes me good. When I am with her, I regret all that you have taught me. I become different from what you have known me to be. I am changed, and the mere touch of Sybil Vane's hand makes me forget you and all your wrong, fascinating, poisonous, delightful theories. And those are? Asked Lord Henry, helping himself to some salad. Oh, your theories about life, your theories about love, your theories about pleasure. All your theories, in fact, Harry. Pleasure is the only thing worth having a theory about, he answered in his slow, melodious voice. But I am afraid I cannot claim my theory as my own. It belongs to nature, not to me. Pleasure is nature's test, her sign of approval. When we are happy, we are always good. But when we are good, we are not always happy. But what do you mean by good? Cried Basil Hallward. Yes, echoed Dorian, leaning back in his chair and looking at Lord Henry over the heavy clusters of purple-lipped irises that stood in the center of the table. What do you mean by good, Harry? To be good is to be in harmony with oneself, he replied, touching the thin stem of his glass with his pale, fine-pointed fingers. Discord is to be forced to be in harmony with others. One's own life, that is the important thing. As for the lives of one's neighbors, if one wishes to be a prig or a Puritan, one can flaunt one's moral views about them, but they are not one's concern. Besides, individualism has really the higher aim. Modern morality consists in accepting the standard of one's age. I consider that for any man of culture to accept the standard of his age is a form of the grossest immorality. Thank you both for following. Enjoy your apprenticeship here. Oh, wait. Oh, my. There's been a lot of people suddenly following is what is happening. Like a lot. I'm gonna have to turn off the follow button, actually. I have no idea what happened. But let me do that real quick. Thank you all for following if you're not bots. I guess. Okay, so hopefully I might have to just turn off the actual box itself because it did not seem to update. Let me see. And let me see if I can get this to work. Apologies for the interruption. Okay, let me see if that, I might need to transition here. Oh, goodness. It's still happening. I'll just turn off my desktop audio. There we go. That'll be fixed. I apologize if any of you guys sub or anything like that while this is happening. I won't be able to notice, so let me know. I got botted. I've never been botted before. I wonder, here, let me just make this so that it's not happening in my own volume situation as well, because it's distracting. Okay. Alright, we're good. We good. Sorry about that. I will continue from where I left off. I'm just going to reread Henry's speech about being good. To be good is to be in harmony with one's self, he replied, touching the thin stem of his glass with his pale, fine-pointed fingers. Discord is to be forced to be in harmony with others. One's own life, that is the important thing. As for the lives of one's neighbors, if one wishes to be a prig or a Puritan, one can flaunt one's moral views about them, but they are not one's concern. Besides, individualism has really the higher aim. Modern morality consists in accepting the standard of one's age. I consider that for any man of culture to accept the standard of his age is a form of the grossest immorality. But surely if one lives merely for oneself, Harry, one pays a terrible price for doing so, suggested the painter. Yes, we are overcharged for everything nowadays. I should fancy that the real tragedy of the poor is that they can afford nothing but self-denial. Beautiful sins, like beautiful things, are the privilege of the rich. One has to pay in other ways but money. What sort of ways, Basil? Oh, I should fancy in remorse, in suffering, in the consciousness of degradation. Lord Henry shrugged his shoulders. My dear fellow, medieval art is charming, but medieval emotions are out of date. One can use them in fiction, of course, but then the only things that one can use in fiction are the things that one has ceased to use in fact. Believe me, no civilized man ever regrets a pleasure, and no civilized man ever knows what a pleasure is. Oh, and no uncivilized man ever knows what a pleasure is. I know what pleasure is, cried Dorian Gray. It is to adore someone. That is certainly better than being adored, he answered, toying with some fruits. Being adored is a nuisance. Women treat us just as humanity treats its gods. They worship us and are always bothering us to do something for them. I should have said that whatever they ask for, they had first given to us, murmured the lad gravely. They create love in our natures. They have a right to demand it back. That is quite true, Dorian, cried Hallward. Nothing is ever quite true, said Lord Henry. This is, interrupted Dorian. You must admit, Harry, that women give to men the very gold of their lives. Possibly, he sighed, but they invariably want it back in such very small change. That is the worry. Women, as some witty Frenchman once put it, inspire us with the desire to do masterpieces, and always prevent us from carrying them out. Harry, you are dreadful. I don't know why I like you so much. You will always like me, Dorian, he replied. Will you have some coffee, you fellows? Waiter, bring coffee, and fine champagne, and some cigarettes. No, don't mind the cigarettes. I have some. Basil, I can't allow you to smoke cigars. You must have a cigarette. A cigarette is the perfect type of a perfect pleasure. It is exquisite, and it leaves one unsatisfied. What more can one want? Yes, Dorian, you will always be fond of me. I represent to you all the sins you have never had the courage to commit. What nonsense you talk, Harry, cried the lad, taking a light from a fire-breathing silver dragon that the waiter had placed on the table. Let us go down to the theatre. When Sybil comes on the stage, you will have a new ideal of life. She will represent something to you that you have never known. I have known everything, said Lord Henry, with a tired look in his eyes, but I am always ready for a new emotion. I am afraid, however, that for me, at any rate, there is no such thing. Still, your wonderful girl may thrill me. I love acting. It is so much more real than life. Let us go. Dorian, you will come with me. I am so sorry, Basil, but there is only room for 2 in the brougham. You must follow us in a hansom. They got up and put on their coats, sipping their coffee standing. The painter was silent and preoccupied. There was a gloom over him. He could not bear this marriage, and yet it seemed to him to be better than many other things that might have happened. After a few minutes they all passed downstairs. He drove off by himself, as had been arranged, and watched the flashing lights of the little brougham in front of him. A strange sense of loss came over him. He felt that Dorian Gray would never again be to him all that he had been in the past. Life had come between them. His eyes darkened, and the crowded, flaring streets became blurred to his eyes. When the cab drew up at the theater, it seemed to him that he had grown years older. And thus the end of chapter 6. It's just like the more and more that I read this book, the more I'm like, Lord Henry, you're not my favorite. You're not my favorite person. Also, he hates women so much. And like Basil and Dorian are like, Henry, stop being so mean to women. And Henry's like, I'm going to be mean to women if I want to be. And I'm like, oh no, you seem like a... No, all right. Poor Basil. Poor Basil indeed. He tried to prevent Dorian from being corrupted, but alas. Oh, Lord Henry is the personification of temptation or the devil. I've never heard of that theory. Interesting. You might have just made it up. I like it. I can see that. I mean, Basil is definitely like the voice of reason, the voice of practicality, the voice of... I don't know what else to call it. Starting to realize you dislike every character in this book? Really, all of them? I don't dislike Dorian. Dorian's just like a little puppy who doesn't know what he's doing. And I don't dislike Basil either. Basil's like, seems to be like the only person who's sane thus far. King Henry VIII. You don't think you liked Basil the first time you read it, but you kind of like him more now. Interesting. Many classic fables about the devil making a contract or tempting, like the golden fiddle. He definitely is the voice of temptation, and he is definitely corrupting Dorian. Like, that's... I don't think that that's even supposed to be a subtle, like, interpretation thing. I think that it's supposed to be very explicitly, he is corrupting Dorian. Dorian was pure. Now Dorian is getting less pure, and that's why Basil keeps getting so sad. Very much a puppy, but he's also a lot. Oh boy, this is what happens when you fill somebody's head with all these pretty terrible thoughts about other people and morality and the purpose of life. Thanks, Lord Henry. At least poor Basil was like, oh no, I'm concerned about the fact that Dorian is getting married. Will he be happy? And Lord Henry is like, who cares? And like poor frickin' Basil's over here like... And then frickin' Lord Henry's like, oh, Basil, you're gonna take your own carriage. And frickin' like, ugh. Because he's old scratch. You don't know how old Dorian is supposed to be? I think Dorian is, he's not a teenage boy. He's 17, he's gonna be 18. Okay, he is a teenage boy, sorry. I thought he was 22. He's 17, he's gonna be 18. He just said that he was about to come of age. Unless coming of age is 21, because then he's 20. But yeah, he's like at the turn. And the thing with Dorian is that Dorian is like the most beautiful person who has ever walked the face of the earth, basically. He's like so super beautiful, and he's been super sheltered, and like he is an innocent... Okay, 20. Okay, I thought that he wasn't 18, but he said he was almost of age, and that confused me. Okay. Then he's 20, and, like, he's just a young lad, and I don't know that he's necessarily innocent, because he, like, hates Jewish people. So, like, So, like, I don't know if I would say that he is innocent, but he definitely, like, was a fertile field who had not had any ideas. It almost seems to me like Dorian is a person who like was never allowed to read books or go to school or anything. So he's just like he just and maybe even hasn't even grown up with religion. So he just like grew up with an as like a tabula rasa. Actually, I believe tabula rasa is an argument that comes up with this book a lot. But it seems like he comes about as kind of a blank slate, and Lord Henry's filling him up with all these ideas. And Basil's like, these ideas are bad, and Dorian's like, yeah, but they're sexy, and like, here we are. What? Innocent people hated Jewish people? Ugh. I mean, I know it's in keeping with the realities of the time, but like, ugh. I don't like it when people are racist in books and then I have to say the racist things. Or when they're sexist and then I have to say the sexist things. And they're like, women are all the same. There's only 5 of them worth talking to. And I'm like, okay, Lord Henry, I understand. You got some misogyny going on because you're probably a closeted homosexual. Let's move on. Oh, they would have parroted views they have no investment in. Got it. That's fair. That's fair. It definitely seems like Dorian is going, because like Basil hasn't been necessarily filling his head with things, but Basil has been like admonishing him if he does something bad and like agreeing with him if he does something good. And it seems like Dorian is just more attracted to the charismatic ways of Lord Henry and his like easy, frankly, like easy, simple solution to the purpose of life. That's really what it seems like Dorian is about up in here. Is just like, this is so easy. The purpose of life is beauty. You're right. This will solve all of my problems. I am an innocent. You're sticking with the devil theory? Alright. Let's see if we get any kind of symbolism up in there to suggest that Lord Henry actually literally is the devil. I definitely don't like him. Alright, that being said, if nobody else has anything to say, I'll start on chapter 7. Okay. Chapter 7. For some reason or other, the house was crowded that night, and the fat Jew manager who met them at the door was beaming from ear to ear with an oily, tremulous smile. He escorted them to their box with a sort of pompous humility, waving his fat jeweled hands and talking at the top of his voice. Dorian Gray loathed him more than ever. He felt as if he had come to look for Miranda and had been met by Caliban. Lord Henry, upon the other hand, rather liked him. At least he declared he did, and insisted on shaking him by the hand and assuring him that he was proud to meet a man who had discovered a real genius and gone bankrupt over a poet. Hallward amused himself with watching the faces in the pit. The heat was terribly oppressive, and the huge sunlight flamed like a monstrous dahlia with petals of yellow fire. The youths in the gallery had taken off their coats and waistcoats and hung them over the side. They talked to each other across the theatre and shared their oranges with the tawdry girls who sat beside them. Some women were laughing in the pit. Their voices were horribly shrill and discordant. The sound of the popping of corks came from the bar. "What a place to find one's divinity in," said Lord Henry. "Yes," answered Dorian Gray. "It was here I found her, and she is divine beyond all living things. When she acts, you will forget everything. These common rough people, with their coarse faces and brutal gestures, become quite different when she is on the stage. They sit silently and watch her. They weep and laugh as she wills them to do. She makes them as responsive as a violin. She spiritualizes them, and one feels that they are of the same flesh and blood as oneself." Okay, I'm sorry. It's just a lot. It's a lot happening here. "The same flesh and blood as oneself? Oh, I hope not," exclaimed Lord Henry, who was scanning the occupants of the gallery through his opera glass. "Don't pay any attention to him, Dorian," said the painter. "I understand what you mean, and I believe in this girl. Anyone you love must be marvelous, and any girl that has the effect you describe must be fine and noble. To spiritualize one's age, that is something worth doing. If this girl can give a soul to those who have lived without one, if she can create the sense of beauty in people whose lives have been sordid and ugly, if she can strip them of their selfishness and lend them tears for sorrows that are not their own, she is worthy of all your adoration, worthy of the adoration of the world. This marriage is quite right. I did not think so at first, but I admit it now. The gods made Sybil Vane for you. Without her, you would have been incomplete. Thanks, Basil, answered Dorian Gray, pressing his hand. I knew that you would understand me. Harry is so cynical. He terrifies me. But here is the orchestra. It is quite dreadful, but it only lasts for about 5 minutes. Then the curtain rises, and you will see the girl to whom I am going to give all my life, to whom I have given everything that is good in me. A quarter of an hour afterwards, amidst an extraordinary turmoil of applause, Sybil Vane stepped on to the stage. Yes, she was certainly lovely to look at, one of the loveliest creatures, Lord Henry thought, that he had ever seen. There was something of the fawn in her shy grace and startled eyes. A faint blush, like the shadow of a rose in a mirror of silver, came to her cheeks as she glanced at the crowded, enthusiastic house. She stepped back a few paces, and her lips seemed to tremble. Basil Hallward leapt to his feet and began to applaud. Motionless, and as one in a dream, sat Dorian Gray, gazing at her. Lord Henry peered through his glasses, murmuring, "Charming, charming." The scene was the hall of Capulet's house, and Romeo in his pilgrim's dress had entered with Mercutio and his other friends. The band, such as it was, struck up a few bars of music, and the dance began. Through the crowd of ungainly, shabbily dressed actors, Sybil Vane moved like a creature from a finer world. Her body swayed while she danced, as a plant sways in the water. The curves of her throat were the curves of a white lily. Her hands seemed to be made of cool ivory. Yet she was curiously listless. She showed no sign of joy when her eyes rested on Romeo. The few words she had to speak, "Good pilgrim, you do wrong your hand too much, which mannerly devotion shows in this. For saints have hands that pilgrims' hands do touch, and palm to palm is holy palmer's kiss." With the brief dialogue that follows were spoken in a thoroughly artificial manner. The voice was exquisite, but from the point of view of tone it was absolutely false. It was wrong in color. It took away all the life from the verse. It made the passion unreal. Dorian Gray grew pale as he watched her. He was puzzled and anxious. Neither of his friends dared to say anything to him. She seemed to them to be absolutely incompetent. They were horribly disappointed. Yet they felt that the true test of any Juliet is the balcony scene of the second act. They waited for that. If she failed there was nothing in her. She looked charming as she came out in the moonlight. That could not be denied. But the staginess of her acting was unbearable, and grew worse as she went on. Her gestures became absurdly artificial. She overemphasized everything that she had to say. The beautiful passage, "Thou knowest the mask of night is on my face, else would a maiden blush bepaint my cheek, for that which thou hast heard me speak tonight," was declaimed with the painful precision of a schoolgirl who has been taught to recite by some second-rate professor of elocution. When she leaned over the balcony and came to these wonderful lines, "Although I joy in thee, I have no joy of this contract tonight. It is too rash, too unadvised, too sudden, too like the lightning, which doth cease to be, ere one can say, it lightens. Sweet, good night. This bud of love by summer's ripening breath may prove a beauteous flower when we next meet." She spoke the words as though they conveyed no meaning to her. It was not nervousness. Indeed, so far from being nervous, she was absolutely self-contained. It was simply bad art. She was a complete failure. Even the common, uneducated audience of the pit and gallery lost their interest in the play. They got restless and began to talk loudly and to whistle. The Jew manager, who was standing at the back of the dress circle, stamped and swore with rage. The only person unmoved was the girl herself. When the second act was over, there came a storm of hisses, and Lord Henry got up from his chair and put on his coat. "She is quite beautiful, Dorian," he said, "but she can't act. Let us go." "I'm going to see the play through," answered the lad in a hard, bitter voice. "I am awfully sorry that I have made you waste an evening, Harry. I apologize to you both." "My dear Dorian, I should think Miss Vane was ill," interrupted Hallward. "We will come some other night." "I wish she were ill," he rejoined, but she seems to me to be simply callous and cold. She has entirely altered. Last night she was a great artist. This evening she is merely a commonplace, mediocre actress." "Don't talk like that about anyone you love, Dorian. Love is a more wonderful thing than art." "They are both simply forms of imitation," remarked Lord Henry. "But do let us go. Dorian, you must not stay here any longer. It is not good for one's morals to see bad acting. Besides, I don't suppose you will want your wife to act, so what does it matter if she plays Juliet like a wooden doll? She's very lovely, and if she knows as little about life as she does about acting, she will be a delightful experience. There are only two kinds of people who are really fascinating: people who know absolutely everything and people who know absolutely nothing. Good heavens, my dear boy, don't look so tragic. The secret of remaining young is never to have an emotion that is unbecoming. Come to the club with Basil and myself. We will smoke cigarettes and drink to the beauty of Sybil Vane. She is beautiful. What more can you want?" "Go away, Harry," cried the lad. "I want to be alone. Basil, you must go. Can't you see that my heart is breaking?" The hot tears came to his eyes. His lips trembled, and, rushing to the back of the box, he leaned up against the wall, hiding his face in his hands. "Let us go, Basil," said Lord Henry with a strange tenderness in his voice, and the two young men passed out together. A few moments afterwards the floodlights flared up, and the curtain rose on the third act. Dorian Gray went back to his seat. He looked pale and proud and indifferent. The play dragged on and seemed interminable. Half of the audience went out, tramping in heavy boots and laughing. The whole thing was a fiasco. The last act was played to almost empty benches. The curtain went down on a titter, and some groans. As soon as it was over, Dorian Gray rushed behind the scenes into the green room. The girl was standing there alone, with a look of triumph on her face. Her eyes were lit with an exquisite fire. There was a radiance about her. Her parted lips were smiling over some secret of their own. When he entered, she looked at him, and an expression of infinite joy came over her. "How badly I acted tonight, Dorian!" she cried. "Horribly," he answered, gazing at her in amazement. "Horribly! It was dreadful! Are you ill? You have no idea what it was! You have no idea what I suffered!" The girl smiled. "Dorian," she answered, lingering over his name with long-drawn music in her voice, as though it were sweeter than honey to the red petals of her mouth. "Dorian, you should have understood. But you understand now, don't you?" "Understand what?" he asked angrily. "Why I was so bad tonight. Why I shall always be bad. Why I shall never act well again." He shrugged his shoulders. "You are ill, I suppose. When you are ill, you shouldn't act. You make yourself ridiculous. My friends were bored. I was bored." She seemed not to listen to him. She was transfigured with joy. An ecstasy of happiness dominated her. "Dorian, Dorian," she cried. "Before I knew you, acting was the one reality of my life. It was the only in the theater that I lived. I thought that it was all true. I was Rosalind one night and Portia the other. The joy of Beatrice was my joy, and the sorrows of Cordelia were mine also. I believed in everything. The common people who acted with me seemed to be godlike. The painted scenes were my world. I knew nothing but shadows, and I thought them real. You came, oh, my beautiful love, and you freed my soul from prison. You taught me what reality really is. Tonight, for the first time in my life, I saw through the hollowness, the sham, the silliness of the empty pageant in which I had always played. Tonight, for the first time, I became conscious that Romeo was hideous and old and painted, that the moonlight in the orchard was false, that the scenery was vulgar, and that the words I had to speak were unreal, were not my words, were not what I wanted to say. You had brought me something higher, something of which all art is but a reflection. You had made me understand what love really is. My love, Prince Charming, Prince of Life! I have grown sick of shadows. You are more to me than all art can ever be. What have I to do with the puppets of a play? When I came on tonight, I could not understand how it was that everything had gone from me. I thought that I was going to be wonderful. I found that I could do nothing. Suddenly it dawned on my soul what it all meant. The knowledge was exquisite to me. I heard them hissing, and I smiled. What could they know of love such as ours? Take me away, Dorian. Take me away with you, where we can be quite alone. I hate the stage. I might mimic a passion that I do not feel, but I cannot mimic one that burns me like fire. Oh, Dorian, Dorian! You understand now what it signifies. Even if I could do it, it would be a profanation for me to play at being in love. You have made me see that." He flung himself down on the sofa and turned away his face. "You have killed my love," he muttered. She looked at him in wonder and laughed. He made no answer. She came across to him and with her little fingers stroked his hair. She knelt down and pressed his hands to her lips. He drew them away, and a shudder ran through him. Then he leapt up and went to the door. "Yes," he cried, "you have killed my love. You used to stir my imagination. Now you don't even stir my curiosity. You simply produce no effect. I loved you because you were marvelous, because you had genius and intellect, because you realized the dreams of great poets and gave shape and substance to the shadows of art. You have thrown it all away. You are shallow and stupid. My God, how mad I was to love you! What a fool I have been! You are nothing to me now. I will never see you again. I will never think of you. I will never mention your name. You don't know what you were to me once. Why, once... I can't bear to think of it. I wish I had never laid eyes upon you. You have spoiled the romance of my life. How little you can know of love if you say it mars your art. Without your art, you are nothing. I would have made you famous, splendid, magnificent. The world would have worshipped you, and you would have borne my name. What are you now? A third-rate actress with a pretty face." The girl grew white and trembled. She clenched her hands together, and her voice seemed to catch in her throat. "You are not serious, Dorian," she murmured. "You are acting." "Acting! I leave that to you. You do it so well," he answered bitterly. She rose from her knees, and with a piteous expression of pain in her face, came across the room to him. She put her hand upon his arm, and looked into his eyes. He thrust her back. "Don't touch me!" he cried. A low moan broke from her, and she flung herself at his feet, and lay there like a trampled flower. "Dorian, Dorian, don't leave me," she whispered. "I'm so sorry I didn't act well. I was thinking of you all the time, but I will try. Indeed, I will try. It came so suddenly across me, my love for you. I think I should never have known it if you had not kissed me, if we had not kissed each other. Kiss me again, my love. Don't go away from me. I couldn't bear it. Oh, don't go away from me, my brother. No, never mind. He didn't mean it. He was unjust. But you, oh, can't you forgive me for tonight? I will work so hard and try to improve. Don't be cruel to me because I love you better than anything in the world. After all, it is only once that I have not pleased you. But you are quite right, Dorian. I should have shown myself more of an artist. It was foolish of me, and yet I couldn't help it. Oh, don't leave me. Don't leave me." A fit of passionate sobbing choked her. She crouched on the floor like a wounded thing, and Dorian Gray, with his beautiful eyes, looked down at her, and his chiseled lips curled in exquisite disdain. There was always something ridiculous about the emotions of people whom one has ceased to love. Sybil Vane seemed to him to be absurdly melodramatic. Her tears and sobs annoyed him. "I'm going," he said at last, in his calm, clear voice. "I don't wish to be unkind, but I can't see you again. You have disappointed me." She wept silently and made no answer, but crept near her. Her little hand stretched blindly out and appeared to be seeking for him. He turned on his heel and left the room. In a few moments he was out of the theater. Where he went to he hardly knew. He remembered wandering through dimly lit streets, past gaunt, black-shadowed archways and evil-looking houses. Women with hoarse voices and harsh laughter had called after him. Drunkards had reeled by cursing and chattering to themselves like monstrous apes. He had seen grotesque children huddled upon doorsteps and heard shrieks and oaths from gloomy courts. As the dawn was just breaking, he found himself close to Covent Garden. The darkness lifted, and flushed with faint fires, the sky hollowed itself into a perfect pearl. Huge carts filled with nodding lilies rumbled slowly down the polished empty street. The air was heavy with the perfume of the flowers, and their beauty seemed to bring him an anodyne for his pain. He followed into the market and watched the men unloading their wagons. A white-smocked carter offered him some cherries. He thanked him and wondered why he refused to accept any money for them, and began to eat them listlessly. They had been plucked at midnight, and the coldness of the moon had entered into them. A long line of boys carrying crates of striped tulips and of yellow and red roses defiled in front of him, threading their way through the huge jade-green piles of vegetables. Under the portico, with its gray sun-bleached pillars, loitered a troop of draggled, bare-headed girls, waiting for the auction to be over. Others crowded round the swinging doors of the coffee-house in the piazza. The heavy cart horses slipped and stamped upon the rough stones, shaking their bells and trappings. Some of the drivers were lying asleep on a pile of sacks. Iris-necked and pink-footed, the pigeons ran about picking up seeds. After a little while he hailed a hansom and drove home. For a few moments he loitered upon the doorstep, looking round at the silent square with its blank, close-shuttered windows and its staring blinds. The sky was pure opal now, and the roofs of the houses glistened like silver against it. From some chimney opposite a thin wreath of smoke was rising. It curled, a violet riband, through the nacre-colored air. In the huge gilt Venetian lantern, spoil of some of Doge's barge, that hung from the ceiling of the great oak-paneled hall of entrance, lights were still burning from 3 flickering jets. Thin blue petals of flames, they seemed, rimmed with white fire. He turned them out, and having thrown his hat and cape on the table, passed through the library towards the door of his bedroom, a large octagonal chamber on the ground floor that, in his new-born feeling for luxury, he had just decorated for himself, and hung with some curious Renaissance tapestries that had been discovered stored in a disused attic at Selby Royal. As he was turning the handle of the door, his eye fell upon the portrait Basil Hallward had painted of him. He started back as if in surprise. Then he went on into his own room, looking somewhat puzzled. After he had taken the buttonhole out of his coat, he seemed to hesitate. Finally he came back, went over to the picture, and examined it. In the dim, arrested light that struggled through the cream-colored silk blinds, the face appeared to him to be a little changed. The expression looked different. One would have said that there was a touch of cruelty in the mouth. It was certainly strange. He turned round and, walking to the window, drew up the blind. The bright dawn flooded the room and swept the fantastic shadows into dusky corners where they lay shuddering. But the strange expression that he had noticed in the face of the portrait seemed to linger there, to be more intensified even. The quivering, ardent sunlight showed him the lines of cruelty round the mouth as clearly as if he had been looking into a mirror after he had done some dreadful thing. He winced and, taking up from the table an oval glass framed in ivory cupids, one of Lord Henry's many presents to him, glanced hurriedly into its polished depths. No line like that warped his red lips. What did it mean? He rubbed his eyes and came close to the picture and examined it again. There were no signs of any change when he looked into the actual painting, and yet there was no doubt that the whole expression had altered. It was not a mere fancy of his own. The thing was horribly apparent. He threw himself into a chair and began to think. Suddenly there flashed across his mind what he had said in Basil Hallward's studio the day the picture had been finished. Yes, he remembered it perfectly. He had uttered a mad wish that he himself might remain young, and the portrait grow old, that his own beauty might be untarnished, and the face on the canvas bear the burden of his passions and his sins, that the painted image might be seared with the lines of suffering and thought, that he might keep all the delicate bloom and loveliness of his then just conscious boyhood. Surely his wish had not been fulfilled. Such things were impossible. It seemed monstrous even to think of them. And yet there was the picture before him, with a touch of cruelty in the mouth. Cruelty! Had he been cruel? It was the girl's fault, not his. He had dreamed of her as a great artist, had given his love to her because he had thought her great. Then she had disappointed him. She had been shallow and unworthy. And yet a feeling of infinite regret came over him as he thought of her lying at his feet sobbing like a little child. He remembered with what callousness he had watched her. Why had he been made like that? Why had such a soul been given to him? But he had suffered also. During the 3 terrible hours that the play had lasted, he had lived centuries of pain, aeon upon aeon of torture. His life was well worth hers. She had marred him for a moment, if he had wounded her for an age. Besides, women were better suited to bear sorrow than men. They lived on their emotions. They only thought of their emotions. When they took lovers, it was merely to have someone with whom they could have scenes. Lord Henry had told him that, and Lord Henry knew what women were. Why should he trouble about Sybil Vane? She was nothing to him now. But the picture, what was he to say of that? It held the secret of his life and told his story. It had taught him to love his own beauty. Would it teach him to loathe his own soul? Would he ever look at it again? No, it was merely an illusion wrought on the troubled senses. The horrible night that he had passed had left phantoms behind it. Suddenly there had fallen upon his brain that tiny scarlet speck that makes men mad. The picture had not changed. It was folly to think so. Yet it was watching him with its beautiful marred face and its cruel smile. Its bright hair gleamed in the early sunlight. Its blue eyes met his own. A sense of infinite pity, not for himself, but for the painted image of himself, came over him. It had altered already and would alter more. Its gold would wither into gray. Its red and white roses would die. For every sin that he committed, a stain would fleck and wreck its fairness. But he would not sin. The picture, changed or unchanged, would be to him the visible emblem of conscience. He would resist temptation. He would not see Lord Henry any more. Would not, at any rate, listen to those subtle poisonous theories that in Basil Hallward's garden had first stirred within him the passion for impossible things. He would go back to Sybil Vane, make her amends, marry her, try to love her again. Yes, it was his duty to do so. She must have suffered more than he had. Poor child! He had been selfish and cruel to her. The fascination that she had exercised over him would return. They would be happy together. His life with her would be beautiful and pure. He got up from his chair and drew a large screen right in front of the portrait, shuddering as he glanced at it. How horrible, he murmured to himself, and he walked across the window and opened it. When he stepped out onto the grass, he drew a deep breath. The fresh morning air seemed to drive away all his somber passions. He thought only of Sybil. A faint echo of his love came back to him. He repeated her name over and over again. The birds that were singing in the dew-drenched garden seemed to be telling the flowers about her. And that was chapter 7. Woo! Oh, dear. Yay! Man, oh man, oh man. This is the thing. This is the thing that I remember about the book. That is the thing, the main thing of the book that I remember. I feel so bad for Sybil. And I feel bad for Sybil because I can relate to her. I can relate to... There have been at least... maybe there's been 3. There have been quite a few men that I have dated who essentially did a similar thing with me that Dorian did with Sybil. Not quite so explicitly, but, you know. They valued me for being more of like a trophy than an actual person. And usually I got rid of them, but once they realized that I was like a real person who had like feelings and emotions and thoughts, and also I was like complicated and I didn't like to put up with bad behavior from them and stuff, like once they realized that I was actually a person who would take effort, they would, they would lose interest. Actually, they wouldn't lose interest. They would try to tell me all of the things that were wrong about myself and try to make me fix them. Like, they would be like, I don't like that you're that way. Maybe you should do something about it, kind of thing. So this whole, like, Dorian falling for Sybil because she is a great actress, and then she disappoints him once by not being what he expects her to be because he's placed her on this pedestal, and then he treats her horribly cruelly because she thought that he truly loved her and he only wanted to use her. I'm like, oof, relatable. Is in some ways an allegory for even the way in which Dorian ruins her is innocent in a way. I see what you mean by saying that, but I disagree that it's innocent. I think it's come from something else. It was because of this chapter. You stopped after this chapter and never went back. Interesting. Because you just were like, wow, Dorian's gross, and that was it for you? Or like because you were like empathizing for Sybil too much, or Jerks was censored? Not on my screen. Yeah, I can see why you would say that Dorian is innocent for ruining her in this way, because lots of people fall into that trap of when they It's not a physical ruination, not innocent in that it's okay, but in the way that it's written as a ruination. Oh, I thought I was more thinking that what you meant by that was that like it is common for people who are in like their first love to put people on pedestals and not treat them like real humans. And that is like so like that's a kind of innocence. I just disagree with it being innocent. You were in high school, so you're not sure. You didn't like this chapter, so you stopped, and then you couldn't force yourself to go back. Fair enough. Fair enough. You were told the whole book was about the supernatural portrait changing, and you don't think you really paid attention to the whole of the book. Oh, interesting. So like, so you were really focused on the supernatural portrait, and less so about like the themes. I guess of the book that like the book is like clearly like getting into. Oh, Damasan, cheers, and thank you for complimenting my braids earlier. I don't remember when that was, but normally a man would, yeah, the traditional series of events from back in the day. Yeah, it is refreshing that this book. See, here's the thing. Thus far, up until this moment, we've been getting all of Lord Henry's suppositions about what life truly is and like what things truly mean. And this is where I start to feel like I don't think like I think a lot of people see Lord Henry and feel like Lord Henry represents the author pretty well because he's like witty and he talks about beauty and he's got all this blah 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 blah. But the actual text of the book, like Dorian carries out Lord Henry's suppositions here and like basically fueled by Lord Henry's ideas about beauty and art and love and all of that, he idolizes Sybil Vane and then throws her away when she doesn't match what he thinks love and art is supposed to be. So I feel like people tend to think like, oh, Lord Henry is like Oscar Wilde. And I'm like, I don't think so though, because the book is like, he ruins Sybil Vane in a way that is more subtle and in a way that is about like a person hurting another person, not about morality. It's not about like, oh, he slept with her and they weren't married back in the day. That was a big deal. It's not about like morality. It's about he did a really unkind thing to her and he is being punished for that and seeing the consequences of that, which is a very like opposing to what Lord Henry's ideas up until now have been. Oh yeah, Chase? It's much more insidious. He basically like he took her like that kind of thing that Dorian did. He treated her like an object, like a disposable object, and when she did not do what pleased him, he threw her away. That kind of thing screws people up for a really long time. Like, I can tell you, being treated as an object for like a huge chunk of your life, for whatever reason, fucks you up. It does, and it's very hard. And she's like, you could argue that his love corrupted her in the first place, and now that he sees the effects that his love has had, he's like, ew, gross, and then he leaves her without anything, without her career and without his love. And it's really a truly very cruel thing, and like it's gonna be hard for if Sable were a real person, this is gonna be a hard thing for her to get over. She's never like that's like she's gonna be dealing with this for a while until she overcomes it. And like don't worry about it, Damazon. I usually when people compliment my looks, as long as they're not like creepy sexual compliments, I'm usually like, because I get it. I get it when you're like, that's really pretty, I gotta tell you. So I'm not judging. In English classes, you did the classic horror novel. Oh, got it. So you were more focused on, got it, that makes sense, on like the staples of the horror genre instead of the themes around it. That makes sense. Dorian Gray is really only touched on for the supernatural portrait, and the rest of the story isn't commented on. I only know, I really genuinely only know the book of Dorian Gray and have like not really seen many references to it or any movies about it or anything like that. It shows the corruption of Dorian. It's not standard level, more under the surface. And even more pointedly, it shows that the corruption is not in him having these ideas. The corruption comes in him acting upon the ideas and hurting someone. Like, him having these annoying ideas isn't the problem. Him hurting somebody is the problem. Honestly, it's like a very progressive message, which is why, like, people quoting Lord Henry and being like, Oscar Wilde was so witty and great. I'm like, I feel like you're missing the point. I feel like you're a lot missing the point. Who is to say? We'll get to the end of the book and then we'll be able to fully argue that point. But it is a very, like, also, like, the whole mental process that Dorian goes through when he's like, oh no, my picture's not going to be beautiful anymore. But it's Sybil's fault. Sybil really deserved it. Like, I might have scarred her for life, but she put me through aeons of discomfort for those 3 hours. I'm like, wow. Oh, wow. I have heard this before in my life, and it's awful again. And then because he sees the consequences, he's like, oh, I guess I could go back and try to right things because I don't want to be punished for being a bad person. I guess I'll go back. Maybe it's not really her fault. I guess I'll go back. Like, that mindset is a very honest mindset of certain kinds of people. Ignorance is bliss subjectively, not objectively. Ignorance is bliss is also such an interesting theme of this book. Of, like, innocence is ignorance is a theme of this book. And one that I think is very interesting. One that will be very interesting to explore. But Dorian's like, it's basically what I'm saying is Dorian's thought processes here just reminds me of the abusive boyfriend that I had when I was younger. He's just like everything of like, but she made me suffer, so it makes sense that I make her suffer. She disappointed me. I have to show her that she was wrong for disappointing me. She needs to do what I want her to do. Because that kind of perspective that he's having, so it's like fascinating to see this portrayed in this book and have it acknowledged within the realm of the book in the 18 to 1900s, that this is a big problem and that he has, like, committed a sin that's marred his soul. Like, that's a very fascinating take for a book that is this old, I think. And that being said, Chapter 8. And you guys can keep talking about any of the discussions while I'm reading. It's fine. This will be the last chapter that we read in this book club. Just so you know, for today. Interesting. It was long past noon when he awoke. His valet had crept several times on tiptoe into the room to see if he was stirring, and had wondered what made his young master sleep so late. Finally his bell sounded, and Victor came softly in with a cup of tea and a pile of letters on a small tray of old Sèvres china, and drew back the olive satin curtains with their shimmering blue lining that hung in front of the 3 tall windows. Monsieur has slept well this morning, he said, smiling. What o'clock is it, Victor? Asked Dorian drowsily. 1 hour and a quarter, monsieur. How late it was! He sat up, and having sipped some tea, turned over his letters. One of them was from Lord Henry, and had been brought by hand that morning. He hesitated for a moment, then put it aside. The others he opened listlessly. They contained the usual collection of cards, invitations to dinner, tickets for private views, programs of charity concerts, and the like, that are showered on fashionable young men every morning during the season. There was a rather heavy bill for a chased silver Louis Quinze toilet set that he had not yet had the courage to send on to his guardians, who were extremely old-fashioned people and did not realize that we live in an age when unnecessary things are our only necessities, and there were several very courteously worded communications from Jermyn Street money-lenders offering to advance any sum of money at a moment's notice and at the most reasonable rates of interest. After about 10 minutes, he got up, and, throwing on an elaborate dressing gown of silk-embroidered cashmere wool, passed into the onyx-paved bathroom. The cool water refreshed him after his long sleep. He seemed to have forgotten all that he had gone through. A dim sense of having taken part in some strange tragedy came to him once or twice, but there was the unreality of a dream about it. As an aside, because I'm going to forget to say this, I think it's fascinating that we've only just entered the actual lived experience and perspective of Dorian Gray now. And I have theories about why, but as soon as he was dressed, he went into the library and sat down to a light French breakfast that had been laid out for him on a small round table close to the open window. It was an exquisite day. The warm air seemed laden with spices. A bee flew in and buzzed round the blue dragon bowl that, filled with sulphur-yellow roses, stood before him. He felt perfectly happy. Suddenly his eye fell on the screen that he had placed in front of the portrait, and he started. "Too cold for monsieur?" asked his valet, putting an omelette on the table. "I shut the window?" Dorian shook his head. "I am not cold," he murmured. Was it all true? Had the portrait really changed? Or had it been simply his own imagination that had made him see a look of evil where there had been a look of joy? Surely a painted canvas could not alter. The thing was absurd. It would serve as a tale to tell Basil some day. It would make him smile. And yet, how vivid was his recollection of the whole thing. First in the dim twilight and then in the bright dawn, he had seen the touch of cruelty round the warped lips. He almost dreaded his valet leaving the room. He knew that when he was alone he would have to examine the portrait. He was afraid of certainty. When the coffee and cigarettes had been brought and the man turned to go, he felt a wild desire to tell him to remain. As the door was closing behind him, he called him back. The man stood waiting for his orders. Dorian looked at him for a moment. "I am not at home to anyone, Victor," he said with a sigh. The man bowed and retired. Then he rose from the table, lit a cigarette, and flung himself down on a luxuriously cushioned couch that stood facing the screen. The screen was an old one, of gilt Spanish leather, stamped and wrought with a rather florid Louis XIV's pattern. He scanned it curiously, wondering if ever before it had concealed the secret of a man's life. Should he move it aside after all? Why not let it stay there? What was the use of knowing? If the thing was true, it was terrible. If it was not true, why trouble about it? But what if, by some fate or deadlier chance, eyes other than his spied behind, and saw the horrible change? What should he do if Basil Hallward came and asked to look at his own picture? Basil would be sure to do that. No, the thing had to be examined, and at once. Anything would be better than this dreadful state of doubt. He got up and locked both doors. At least he would be alone when he looked upon the mask of his shame. Then he drew the screen aside and saw himself face to face. It was perfectly true. The portrait had altered. As he often remembered afterwards, and always with no small wonder, he found himself at first gazing at the portrait with a feeling of almost scientific interest. That such a change should have taken place was incredible to him, and yet it was a fact. Was there some subtle affinity between the chemical atoms that shaped themselves into form and color on the canvas, and the soul that was within him? Could it be that what that soul thought they realized? That what it dreamed they made true? Or was there some other more terrible reason? He shuddered and felt afraid, and going back to the couch, lay there, gazing at the picture in sickened horror. One thing, however, he felt that it had done for him. It had made him conscious how unjust, how cruel he had been to Sybil Vane. It was not too late to make reparation for that. She could still be his wife. His unreal and selfish love would yield to some higher influence, would be transformed into some nobler passion, and the portrait that Basil Hallward had painted of him would be a guide to him through life, would be to him what holiness is to some, and conscience to others, and the fear of God to us all. But there were opiates for remorse, drugs that could lull the moral sense to sleep. But here was a visible symbol of the degradation of sin. Here was an ever-present sign of the ruin men brought upon their souls. 3 o'clock struck, and 4, and the half-hour rang its double chime, but Dorian Gray did not stir. He was trying to gather up the scarlet threads of life and to weave them into a pattern, to find his way through the sanguine labyrinth of passion through which he was wandering. He did not know what to do, or what to think. Finally he went over to the table and wrote a passionate letter to the girl he had loved, imploring her forgiveness and accusing himself of madness. He covered page after page with wild words of sorrow and wilder words of pain. There is a luxury in self-reproach. When we blame ourselves, we feel that no one else has a right to blame us. It is the confession, not the priest, that gives us absolution. When Dorian had finished the letter, he felt that he had been forgiven. Suddenly there came a knock to the door, and he heard Lord Henry's voice outside. "My dear boy, I must see you. Let me in at once. I can't bear your shutting yourself up like this." He made no answer at first, but remained quite still. Knocking still continued and grew louder. Yes, it was better to let Lord Henry in, and to explain to him the new life he was going to lead, to quarrel with him if it became necessary to quarrel, to part if parting was inevitable. He jumped up, drew the screen hastily across the picture, and unlocked the door. "I am so sorry for it all, Dorian," said Lord Henry as he entered. "But you must not think too much about it." "Do you mean about Sybil Vane?" asked the lad. "Yes, of course," answered Lord Henry, sinking into a chair and slowly pulling off his yellow gloves. "It is dreadful from one point of view, but it was not your fault. Tell me, did you go behind and see her after the play was over?" "Yes." "I felt sure you had. Did you make a scene with her?" "I was brutal, Harry, perfectly brutal. But it is all right now. I am not sorry for anything that has happened. It has taught me to know myself better." "Ah, Dorian, I am so glad you take it in that way. I was afraid I would find you plunged in remorse and tearing that nice curly hair of yours." "I have got through all that," said Dorian, shaking his head and smiling. "I am perfectly happy now. I know what conscience is, to begin with. It is not what you told me it was. It is the divinest thing in us. Don't sneer at it, Harry, any more. At least not before me. I want to be good. I can't bear the idea of my soul being hideous." "A very charming artistic basis for ethics, Dorian. I congratulate you on it. But how are you going to begin?" "By marrying Sybil Vane." "Marry Sybil Vane!" cried Lord Henry, standing up and looking at him in perplexed amazement. "But, my dear Dorian—" "Yes, Harry, I know what you are going to say. Something dreadful about marriage. Don't say it. Don't ever say things of that kind to me again. 2 days ago I asked Sybil to marry me. I am not going to break my word to her. She is to be my wife." "Your wife? Dorian, didn't you get my letter? I wrote to you this morning and sent the note down by my own man." "Your letter? Oh, yes, I remember. I have not read it yet, Harry. I was afraid there might be something in it that I wouldn't like. You cut life to pieces with your epigrams." "You know nothing, then." "What do you mean?" Lord Henry walked across the room and, sitting down by Dorian Gray, took both his hands in his own and held them tightly. "Dorian," he said, "my letter—don't be frightened—was to tell you that Sybil Vane is dead." A cry of pain broke from the lad's lips, and he leapt to his feet, tearing his hands away from Lord Henry's grasp. "Dead? Sybil! Dead! It is not true. It is a horrible lie. How dare you say it?" "It is quite true, Dorian," said Lord Henry gravely. "It is in all the morning papers. I wrote down to you to ask you not to see anyone till I came. There will have to be an inquest, of course, and you must not be mixed up in it. Things like that make a man fashionable in Paris, but in London people are so prejudiced. Here one should never make one's debut with a scandal. One should reserve that to give an interest to one's old age. I suppose they don't know your name at the theatre? If they don't, it is all right. Did anyone see you going round to her room? That is an important point." Dorian did not answer for a few moments. He was dazed with horror. Finally he stammered in a stifled voice, "Harry, did you say an inquest? What did you mean by that? Did Sybil— Oh, Harry, I can't bear it. But be quick. Tell me everything at once." "I have no doubt it was not an accident, Dorian, though it must be put in that way to the public. It seems that as she was leaving the theatre with her mother about 12:30 or so, she said she had forgotten something upstairs. They waited some time for her, but she did not come down again. They ultimately found her lying dead on the floor of her dressing-room. She had swallowed something by mistake, some dreadful thing they use at the theatres. I don't know what it was, but it had either prussic acid or white lead in it. I should fancy it was prussic acid, as she seems to have died instantaneously." Harry, it is terrible," cried the lad. "Yes, it is very tragic, of course, but you must not get yourself mixed up in it. I see by the Standard that she was 17. I should have thought she was almost younger than that. She looked such a child and seemed to know so little about acting. Dorian, you mustn't let this thing get on your nerves. You must come and dine with me, and afterwards we will look in at the opera. She is a Paddy night, and everybody will be there." "It is a Paddy night, and everybody will be there. You can come to my sister's box. She has got some smart women with her." "So I have murdered Sybil Vane. said Dorian Gray, half to himself. "Murdered her as surely as if I had cut her little throat with a knife. Yet the roses are not less lovely for all that. The birds sing just as happily in my garden. And tonight I am to dine with you, and then go on to the opera, and sup somewhere, I suppose, afterwards. How extraordinarily dramatic life is! If I had read all this in a book, Harry, I think I would have wept over it. Somehow, now that it has happened actually and to me, it seems far too wonderful for tears. Here is the first passionate love letter I have ever written in my life. Strange that my first passionate love letter should have been addressed to a dead girl. Can they feel, I wonder, those white silent people we call the dead? Sybil, can she feel or know or listen? Oh, Harry, how I loved her once. It seems years ago to me now. She was everything to me. Then came that dreadful night. Was it really only last night? When she played so badly and my heart almost broke. She explained it all to me. It was terribly pathetic, but I was not moved a bit. I thought her shallow. Suddenly something happened that made me afraid. I can't tell you what it was, but it was terrible. I said I would go back to her. I felt I had done wrong, and now she is dead. My God. My God! Harry, what shall I do? You don't know the danger I am in, and there is nothing to keep me straight. She would have done that for me. She had no right to kill herself. It was selfish of her. My dear Dorian, answered Lord Henry, taking a cigarette from his case and producing a gold Latin matchbox. The only way a woman can ever reform a man is by boring him so completely that he loses all possible interest in life. If you had married this girl, you would have been wretched. Of course, you would have treated her kindly. One can always be kind to people about whom one cares nothing. But she would have soon found out that you were absolutely indifferent to her. And when a woman finds that out about her husband, she either becomes dreadfully dowdy or wears very smart bonnets that some other woman's husband has to pay for. I say nothing about the social mistake which would have been abject, which, of course, I would not have allowed, but I assure you that in any case the whole thing would have been an absolute failure. I suppose it would, muttered the lad, walking up and down the room and looking horribly pale. But I thought it was my duty. It is not my fault that this terrible tragedy has prevented my doing what was right. I remember your saying once that there is a fatality about good resolutions, that they are always made too late. Mine certainly were. Good resolutions are useless attempts to interfere with scientific laws. Their origin is pure vanity. Their result is absolutely nil. They give us, now and then, some of those luxurious, sterile emotions that have a certain charm for the weak. That is all that can be said for them. They are simply checks that men draw on a bank where they have no account. Harry! Cried Dorian Gray, coming over and sitting down beside him. Why is it that I cannot feel this tragedy as much as I want to? I don't think I am heartless. Do you? You have done too many foolish things during the last fortnight to be entitled to give yourself that name, Dorian, answered Lord Henry with his sweet, melancholy smile. The lad frowned. I don't like that explanation, Harry, he rejoined, but I am glad you don't think I am heartless. I am nothing of the kind. I know I am not, and yet I must admit that this thing that has happened does not affect me as it should. It seems to me to be simply like a wonderful ending to a wonderful play. It has all the terrible beauty of a Greek tragedy, a tragedy in which I took a great part, but by which I have not been wounded. It is an interesting question, said Lord Henry, who found an exquisite pleasure in playing on the lad's unconscious egotism. An extremely interesting question. I fancy that the true explanation is this. It often happens that the real tragedies of life occur in such an inartistic manner that they hurt us by their crude violence, their absolute incoherence, their absurd want of meaning, their entire lack of style. They affect us just as vulgarity affects us. They give us an impression of sheer brute force, and we revolt against that. Sometimes, however, a tragedy that possesses artistic elements of beauty crosses our lives. If these elements of beauty are real, the whole thing simply appeals to our sense of dramatic effect. Suddenly we find that we are no longer the actors, but the spectators of the play. Or rather, we are both. We watch ourselves, and the mere wonder of the spectacle enthralls us. In the present case, what is it that has really happened? Someone has killed herself for love of you. I wish that I had ever had such an experience. It would have made me in love with love for the rest of my life. The people who have adored me, there have not been many, but there have been some, have always insisted on living on long after I had ceased to care for them, or they to care for me. They have become stout and tedious, and when I meet them they go in at once for reminiscences. That awful memory of woman. What a fearful thing it is, and what an utter intellectual stagnation it reveals. One should absorb the color of life, but one should never remember its details. Details are always vulgar. I must sow poppies in my garden, sighed Dorian. There is no necessity, rejoined his companion. Life has always poppies in her hands. Of course, now and then things linger. I once wore nothing but violets all through one season, as a form of artistic mourning for a romance that would not die. Ultimately, however, it did die. I forget what killed it. I think it was her proposing to sacrifice the whole world for me. That is always a dreadful moment. It fills one with the terror of eternity. Well, would you believe it? A week ago at Lady Hampshire's, I found myself seated at dinner next to the lady in question, and she insisted on going over the whole thing again and digging up the past and raking up the future. I had buried my romance in a bed of asphodel. She dragged it out again and assured me that I had spoiled her life. I am bound to state that she ate an enormous dinner, so I did not feel any anxiety. But what a lack of taste she showed! The one charm of the past is that it is the past. But women never know when the curtain has fallen. They always want a sixth act, and as soon as the interest of the play is entirely over, they propose to continue it. If they were allowed their own way, every comedy would have a tragic ending, and every tragedy would culminate in a farce. They are charmingly artificial, but they have no sense of art. You are more fortunate than I am. I assure you, Dorian, that not one of the women I have known would have done for me what Sybil Vane did for you. Ordinary women always console themselves. Some of them do it by going in for sentimental colors. Never trust a woman who wears mauve, whatever her age may be, or a woman over 35 who is fond of pink ribbons. It always means that they have a history. Others find a great consolation in suddenly discovering the good qualities of their husbands. They flaunt their conjugal felicity in one's face as if it were the most fascinating of sins. Religion consoles some. Its mysteries have all the charm of a flirtation, a woman once told me, and I can quite understand it. Besides, nothing makes one so vain as being told one is a sinner. Conscience makes egotists of us all. Yes, there is really no end to the consolations that women find in modern life. Indeed, I have not mentioned the most important one. What is that, Harry? Said the lad listlessly. Oh, the obvious consolation. Taking someone else's admirer when one loses one's own. In a good society, that always whitewashes a woman. But really, Dorian, how different Sybil Vane must have been from all the women one meets. There is something to me quite beautiful about her death. I am glad I am living in a century when such wonders happen. They make one believe in the reality of the things we all play with, such as romance, passion, and love. I was terribly cruel to her. You forget that. I'm afraid that women appreciate cruelty, downright cruelty, more than anything else. They have wonderfully primitive instincts. We have emancipated them, but they remain slaves looking for their masters all the same. They love being dominated. I am sure you are splendid. I have never seen you really and absolutely angry, but I can fancy how delightful you looked. And after all, you said something to me the day before yesterday that seemed to me at the time to be merely fanciful, but that I see now was absolutely true, and it holds the key to everything. What was that, Harry? You said to me that Sybil Vane represented to you all the heroines of romance, that she was Desdemona one night and Ophelia the other, that if she died as Juliet, she came to life as Imogen. She will never come to life again now, muttered the lad, burying his face in his hands. No, she will never come to life. She's played her last part, but you must think of that lonely death in the tawdry dressing-room simply as a strange, lurid fragment from some Jacobean tragedy, as a wonderful scene from Webster, or Ford, or Cyril Tourneur. The girl never really lived, and so she has never really died. To you, at least, she was always a dream, a phantom that flitted through Shakespeare's plays and left them lovelier for its presence, a reed through which Shakespeare's music sounded richer and more full of joy. The moment she touched actual life, she marred it, and it marred her, and so she passed away. Mourn for Ophelia, if you like. Put ashes on your head because Cordelia was strangled. Cry out against heaven because the daughter of Brabantio died, but don't waste your tears over Sybil Vane. She was less real than they are. There was a silence. The evening darkened in the room. Noiselessly and with silver feet, the shadows crept in from the garden. The colors faded wearily out of things. After some time, Dorian Gray looked up. You have explained me to myself, Harry, he murmured, with something of a sigh of relief. I felt all that you have said, but somehow I was afraid of it, and I could not express it to myself. How well you know me! But we will not talk again of what has happened. It has been a marvelous experience, that is all. I wonder if life has still in store for me anything as marvelous. Life has everything in store for you, Dorian. There is nothing that you, with your extraordinary good looks, will not be able to do. But suppose, Harry, I became haggard and old and wrinkled. What then? Ah, then, said Lord Henry, rising to go. Then, my dear Dorian, you would have to fight for your victories. As it is, they are brought to you. No, you must keep your good looks. We live in an age that reads too much to be wise, and that thinks too much to be beautiful. We cannot spare you. And now you had better dress and drive down to the club. We are rather late as it is. I think I shall join you at the opera, Harry. I feel too tired to eat anything. What is the number of your sister's box? 27, I believe. It is on the grand tier. You will see her name on the door. But I am sorry you won't come and dine. I don't feel up to it, said Dorian listlessly, but I am awfully obliged to you for all that you have said to me. You are certainly my best friend. No one has ever understood me as you have. We are only at the beginning of our friendship, Dorian, answered Lord Henry, shaking him by the hand. Good-bye. I shall see you before 9:30, I hope. Remember, Patty is singing. As he closed the door behind him, Dorian Gray touched the bell, and in a few minutes Victor appeared with the lamps and drew the blinds down. He waited impatiently for him to go. The man seemed to take an interminable time over everything. As soon as he had left, he rushed to the screen and drew it back. No, there was no further change in the picture. It had received the news of Sybil Vane's death before he had known of it himself. It was conscious of the events of life as they occurred. The vicious cruelty that marred the fine lines of the mouth had no doubt appeared at the very moment that the girl had drunk the poison, whatever it was. Or was it indifferent to results? Did it merely take cognizance of what passed within the soul? He wondered and hoped that some day he would see the change taking place before his very eyes, shuddering as he hoped it. Poor Sybil! What a romance it had all been! She had often mimicked death on the stage. Then death himself had touched her and taken her with him. How had she played that dreadful last scene? Had she cursed him as she died? No, she had died for love of him, and love would always be a sacrament to him now. She had atoned for everything by the sacrifice she had made of her life. He would not think any more of what she had made him go through on that horrible night at the theater. When he thought of her, it would be as a wonderful tragic figure sent on to the world's stage to show the supreme reality of love. A wonderful tragic figure? Tears came to his eyes as he remembered her childlike look, and winsome fanciful ways, and shy, tremulous grace. He brushed them away hastily, and looked again at the picture. He felt that the time had really come for making his choice. Or had his choice already been made? Yes, life had decided that for him. Life and his own infinite curiosity about life. Eternal youth, infinite passion, pleasures, subtle and secret, wild joys and wilder sins. He was to have all these things. The portrait was to bear the burden of his shame. That was all. A feeling of pain crept over him as he thought of the desecration that was in store for the fair face on the canvas. Once, in boyish mockery of Narcissus, he had kissed, or feigned to kiss, those painted lips that now smiled so cruelly at him. Morning after morning he had sat before the portrait, wondering at its beauty, almost enamored of it, as it seemed to him as times. Was it to alter now with every mood to which he yielded? Was it to become a monstrous and loathsome thing, to be hidden away in a locked room, to be shut out from the sunlight that had so often touched to brighter gold the waving wonder of its hair? The pity of it! The pity of it! For a moment he thought of praying that the horrible sympathy that existed between him and the picture might cease. It had changed in answer to a prayer. Perhaps in answer to a prayer it might remain unchanged. And yet, who that knew anything about life would surrender the chance of remaining always young, however fantastic that chance might be, or with what fateful consequences it might be fraught? Besides, was it really under his control? Had it indeed been prayer that had produced the substitution? Might there not be some curious scientific reason for it all? If thought could exercise its influence upon a living organism, might not thought exercise an influence upon dead and inorganic things? Nay, without thought or conscious desire, might not things external to ourselves vibrate in unison with our moods and passions, atom calling to atom in secret love of strange affinity? But the reason was of no importance. He would never again tempt by a prayer any terrible power. If the picture was to alter, it was to alter. That was all. Why inquire too closely into it? For there would be a real pleasure in watching it. He would be able to follow his mind into its secret places. This portrait would be to him the most magical of mirrors. As it had revealed to him his own body, so it would reveal to him his own soul. And when winter came upon it, he would still be standing where spring trembles on the verge of summer. When the blood crept from its face and left behind a pallid mask of chalk with leaden eyes, he would keep the glamour of boyhood. Not one blossom of his loveliness would ever fade. Not one pulse of his life would ever weaken. Like the gods of the Greeks, he would be strong and fleet and joyous. What did it matter what happened to the colored image on the canvas? He would be safe. That was everything. He drew the screen back into its former place in front of the picture, smiling as he did so, and passed into his bedroom, where his valet was already waiting for him. An hour later, he was at the opera, and Lord Henry was leaning over his chair. And that was chapter 8, and where we will leave off with book club for today. Frank, thank you for resubscribing. Welcome back to the fold. I'm sorry your alert didn't play. We got bombed, or whatever it's called. We got botted earlier. Chase, I agree. I really love those kinds of themes in books of this time. It's one of the reasons that I like this era of literature so much, is that the science and mysticism like coexisted at one, and it basically brought really interesting books into play. Spurty Magoo. That's hilarious. Here, let's play some music in this silence. Again, with each chapter that passes, I'm just like, wow, I hate Lord Henry. You choose the route of evil. Hey, Pumpkin. Hi. You hate everything about Dorian and everything we learned about him in this chapter. Also, fuck you, Lord Henry. That's fair. But you know, it goes to show, like, Dorian himself was on the verge of reckoning. Like, he didn't feel anything about Sybil Vane's death, but that could be attributed to shock. Like, normally when something like that happens to you, you just kind of are like, what? What are you saying? Oh right, I turned the desktop volume down. Because of the things. I turn on the music, but you guys can't hear it. Yeah, but normally when something like that happens... you know, you're in shock. And then Lord Henry is there and just literally talks him out of feeling any kind of bad. Should be played by John Hamm? Who's John Hamm? John Hamm. Oh, Don Draper. Interesting. Interesting. I would have picked somebody with a meaner face. Yeah. Yeah. Lord Henry's pretty damn despicable. Lord Henry's pretty freaking gross. But you know, this isn't an uncommon thing that happens. I mean, he felt that he was at fault. Lord Henry talked him out of it. This is the thing that is interesting. I was friends with this like circle of boys when I was younger that I ended up realizing were really terrible people. This kind of conversation has happened. It has happened in front of me. I don't want to specify what about, but there was a very big deal that happened, and I tried to address it with one of the boys through mediation, and it was like a really, really big, like a literal crime had been committed, so it was like a big fucking deal. And as I was explaining what the boy did was wrong, one of the other boys chimes in and goes, oh, you know, but that's just Kara's perspective. That's not really how everybody will see it. You haven't done anything wrong, and you don't have to worry about whether you've done this to anybody else. So, like, the thing that I'm finding the most interesting about this book right now is that even though it seems like comically villainous, how Lord Henry is coming in and assuring Dorian that he hasn't done anything wrong to Sybil Vane and that he's still a good guy, and forget about it, come with me to the opera. That conversation actually happens. That's like part of the ways that violence against women gets condoned in the first place. Is that like people are like, oh dude, you just made a mistake, and like, you know, she was crazy and she was the one who did that, and it's not, you didn't do anything, you're good, you don't have to worry about it, just forget about her, don't worry about it at all. And like, the boys will take that and they'll be like, you're right, you're right, you're right. She was the wrong one, not me. And Boys Will Be Boys has been around for a long time. If you have a good teacher, you can point out to high schoolers what is happening between Dorian and Henry. Because what is happening between Dorian and Henry happens to high schoolers all the time. Like, especially, like I said, amongst high school boys. The problem is, this book is more treated like a fun, supernatural, gay, like that. Like, it's more like, oh, it's a super gay book and there's this supernatural thing and the haha. And it's not like examined for basically what is happening, which is this is how bad things get culturally accepted in society. And this is how bad things happen. Like, the book is literally illustrating it for people step by step. This is what happens. Like, you have empathy for somebody who has done a bad thing. You tell them that they shouldn't feel so bad and be too hard on themselves. And that turns into them thinking that actually they have done nothing wrong. And let's think of all of the reasons why the other person is truly at fault in this situation. It's a brilliant painting of that. It would be great for high schoolers to be exposed to that if that was the context high schoolers were exposed to it in. But it's usually people are exposed to it in the context of Oscar Wilde is super gay. And it's and it's supernatural and cool. And that's really frustrating to me. Yeah, that's very fair, Bully Birdie. Psychiatric care was pretty much non-existent back then. Yep. Unless you just wanted to go into a... I guess Freud was like kind of coming in around this time, but like unless you wanted to go into a the insane asylum. And mostly women just got sent in there when they were just unfortunate to deal with anyways, so... But yeah, this is a really good book, and I don't know. I almost wish I could tell you guys in more detail what the situation between me and those boys had been, because it was really ghastly. And it's amazing that like anybody would try to excuse what had happened to me. And what was even more amazing was that I saw in front of me as the boy who had been excused, who had been given this excuse. Like, basically, I told him he had done something wrong. He said, but I've done that to a lot of people, and now I'm worried about what I must have put them through. And then the boy said in response, oh no, don't worry, it's just Kara. She's just choosing to be upset about this. And the other boy responded, and he said, yeah, you're right. Yeah, other people do this. This is probably fine. And I appreciate that you would have harvested. That happened in front of me, and I just like a window closed down over my face. It was really weird. That was the moment when I was like, I'm never going to speak to you guys again. And they did not realize that that was what had happened within me, and they were like, we're still gonna be friends, right? And I was like, I have to agree with you guys right now because one of you guys drove me here, so I need you guys to take me home. So I'm just gonna bide my time and just pretend that everything is fine, and then I'm gonna ghost you because I don't feel comfortable telling you guys why I don't want to be friends with you anymore, because you do shit like this, so I don't trust you at all anymore. I mean, but Nathan, it's not, high schoolers don't usually have enough world experience. All of the books that I read that were classics when I was back in high school, I didn't understand them until I read them again as a 20-year-old who had more, a 20-something-year-old who had more life experience and more, just more understanding of what was going on. So I can look at Dorian Gray, because I read this book in high school and I did not pick up on any of this stuff. Because everyone was like, this book is just the gay. So I was like, oh yeah, it was good. And I didn't pick up on any of the minute of what is actually happening here. Sadly necessary violence. I love it. Thank you, Harvest. I love it. But yeah, So as I'm rereading Dorian Gray, I'm understanding that I actually really like this book a lot more than I thought I did. And that is the conclusion that I'm coming to. Fair enough, Dawn. Good. This book is making you so mad. To be fair, the book, I mean, I don't think that the book should be making you mad because the book is definitely condemning what is happening here. But it's also an exploratory dive into how these bad things happen and how we. Because, like, honestly, though, I'm like understanding that Oscar Wilde is probably just like a freaking master because he's like sitting here being like, look at the intersection of like class and power and like look at what happens. This poor like this girl from a poor background who like got dicked around by this gentleman and it was unfair and cruel and here's how they get to go on with their lives and just keep doing it. And it's like such an it's an interesting call out. I haven't read a book like this that takes place that was written in the same time period, or even many books that were like this that were written today, where like it shows why somebody is being like this and still condemns them and doesn't try to like sympathize. Oh, we're so sympathetic for Dorian here. Oh, he's so. Oh, he doesn't deserve it. Like it's not doing any of that kind of stuff like we see nowadays. So, oh, you hate them so much? That's fair. It's meant to be a cautionary tale. His attempts to try to point out problems and be a call out. He had a position that allowed him to call it out, and he did it. And that's really incredible. Like again, I didn't pick up on any of this in high school either, and like my respect for him is just growing. And again, this is why I know we already discussed it, but like this is another reason why I'm so frustrated that what I knew about this book and what I was taught about this book in high school was that Oscar Wilde is gay, and they didn't go into any of the themes behind the book. The themes behind this book are important, and we should be examining them with more context than just isn't Oscar Wilde gay. I'm so frustrated with like the schooling that I got because this book is very good and it deserves to be treated like its themes are important and not like it's just important because Oscar Wilde was gay. It's fine. I'm fine. And again, interpreting the book as an extension of the author is a very valid interpretation. It's just not at the expense of what the book is about, man. Hopefully, teachers will be better about that in the future. Because I'm just sad now that I like missed out on the opportunity to learn about this when I was younger because it would have saved me some hardship, honestly. If I had realized that that's what this book was doing, to that extent, these people in this book were just acting like people around me I knew acted, so I didn't realize that they were acting in a way that was bad. You know what I mean? I wish that had been discussed. Anyways, very interesting, very good book. I'm like, it's like rising in my esteem as we're going through it. Mm, that's fair. I think it's also hard when you're an adult because, like, all of the books that I read as an adult that were classics, I wouldn't know where I was missing things as a youth. Like, I wouldn't know where my lack of life experience would come into play. So if we talked about Dorian Gray to kids, I would be able to be like, oh, here's the things that you probably missed. But like, if I had to teach, I don't know, Gulliver's Travels, which I haven't read, and I so I'd be reading it for the first time as an adult. I'm not sure if I would know what would go over a teen's head. People still actively think like Lord Henry, so the only thing that stands out other than that is the gay and the supernatural. That's super true, Nathan. And that's unfortunate. It's so interesting. This book is basically being like, and what's even more interesting is that Dorian Gray is faced with the consequences of his behavior and then basically is like, who cares? He's like, it's not happening to me. It's only happening to me, to the portrait. So that's fascinating. Like, he's just becoming more like Lord Henry. He's like, this is fascinating and scientific. Blah, blah, blah. I've heard Gulliver's Travels is really good, and I bet that I would like it. I'm hoping to read like most of the main books in the canon, even though that means that it's not going to be any books by like people of color or anything like that. um, Man, I super wish that we could read Chinua Achebe's Things Fall Apart, but copyright laws. Man. Man. Well, anyways. Oh, not knowing what will go over a kid's head is a cop out? Really? That's just my supposition from I don't know, from my own knowledge for right now is that I feel like I would miss it, but I will accept it if you think it's a cop out. It's so interesting that this book is hmm. And there's so many things. We read Heart of Darkness, and I hate that book. In my English class, I've learned nothing about that book. All I learned was that a guy was racist in Africa. That's all I learned about Heart of Darkness. Well, yeah, I'm not saying that like teachers don't go over everything. I'm saying that I'm not sure that teachers would even be aware of which things that they need to go over. Cuz like I don't think that like in teaching materials about Dorian Gray this comes up. At least from what I know of English in college, this is not the kind of thing that comes up when discussing books. You discuss them from the author's life, the author's background, the historical context of the time. You talk about the broad strokes of the plot, and that's kind of it. And so, yeah, I was more saying that I'm just not sure whether they are even aware that that is a thing that they could talk about. Yeah. If there was a worksheet and teachers weren't teaching that aspect of it, then but like teachers have been taught that when it comes to books by like black people or books by gay people or books by women, that the thing that you need to focus on is race or sexuality or gender in that order. That's what they do. They're like, Jane Austen, let's read Jane Austen because she really talks about what it was like to be a woman back in the day. And I'm like, or, or you could do that and it's just a really big thing that I hate about academic literature. Anyways, we're going to be winding down the stream. I need to rest my throat somewhat. Mm. It probably does depend on the college. I went to a state college because I didn't want to pay for debt. Woo! It's not super explicit and people can rationalize their thinking so they don't bother. If you think that kind of thing is normal, if you think that kind of thing is okay, or if you're like and I'm not sure if this is true, but like again, my main experiences of people who have thought like this and have excused each other for bad behavior. Actually, then now that I think about it, my main experiences is that people in power will excuse each other's bad behavior in this way. So if it was like a racially tinged thing, I've had like white women do that kind of thing, like excuse each other for something that I'm calling them out for, which is weird. Like I'm like, "Hey, you did this, that was bad." And then they're like, "Oh no, I'm so sorry." And then their friend is like, "Don't worry, I'm sure that it's okay." And I'm like, "You are not the person who gets to say that because she was racist to me." So it's like whoever is the person in power. So I feel like that's part of the issue is that a lot of teachers that we have in schools tend to be, people who come from more privileged backgrounds by definition because you need a degree to teach and like that is something that is not as accessible for different kinds of people and like getting a job as like a gay person is hard and all of that kind of thing. Do I record these readings at all? I do. They are archived both on the YouTube and on Twitch, but I would suggest watching the archives on Twitch just because I am usually really slow in putting up the archives on YouTube, so to catch up on the book, you'd need to watch them on Twitch. But yeah, you can go back and watch chapters 1 through 3 and chapters 4 through 8. I think 8 or 9. And like I said, I need to wind down the stream or else my throat's going to die. So, would we all like to share one good thing that happened to us today or one good thing we're looking forward to tomorrow? There's some things that I am looking forward to that I cannot voice, but I will hopefully be able to voice to you tomorrow. Also, book club next week might get rescheduled or postponed. I can't tell you why, but hopefully I'll be able to tell you why soon. Going to sleep without an alarm set. Oh, nice! Sleep well and deeply, Harvest. Exciting! Yeah, hopefully. Hopefully. I like to be able to tell people about the things that are happening. And they're happening in like a week. So. I love that for you. Mystery news, indeed. So much mystery news. Oh, and if you missed it, on Saturday morning, I believe, I will be playing D&D for charity at 8 a.m. On the TPK Roleplay channel. So it will be a good time. If that is within your time zone, please come and watch me play D&D on, I believe, Saturday morning. I have tweeted about it. I will tweet about it again in the upcoming weeks. But yes, there you go. Oh, I gave you something to look forward to tomorrow. Oh, thanks, Bully Birdie. I believe that's what I'm going to be able to tell you. I believe. 8 a.m. PST, yes. 8 a.m. PST, different times for whatever it is. Chocolate chip pancakes for lunch? Oh my God. I haven't had chocolate. Oh my God, that sounds amazing. Melty chocolate chip pancakes? Oh, that sounds really good. Damn, I want some chocolate chip pancakes right now. Yeah, happy birthday again, Dawn! Congratulations on another successful year. Thanks for spending some of your birthday with us. You ordered an art tablet and you think it's going to help you draw more. You may even start streaming. I hope that goes well for you. Tablets are really cool. I like them a lot. And they're really fun. Yeah. You're about to get groceries? That is exciting. Having a full pantry is very exciting. I always feel really like anxious when my pantry is not full for some reason. I'm like, but then I can't get food. So, yeah. And let me see here. All right. I think that we shall raid a person. Let me see here. Let me see here. Who to raid? I don't believe we've raided this person in quite some time. So I think that we should raid them. Oh no, never mind. Never mind. They're ending their stream. Not them. Let's see who else then. Which version of the game is this? Is this the original? It is the original. That could be fun. Okay. I know who to raid. So we are going to be raiding Namaroth, who is currently playing just kidding. I'm sorry. I looked at it and I saw that it's spoiler talk, so I'm actually not. I haven't beaten the game that person is playing, so I'm not actually. Sorry, I keep having to change who I'm gonna raid. We are gonna raid. Oh Jesus. Are you still going? Okay, we're gonna raid Alpha Gamma. It's Final Fantasy VII, but it was the original Final Fantasy VII, so I thought it was okay, but then it said in the title, warning, Final Fantasy VII compilation spoiler talk, and I was like, yeah. So, instead, we shall raid Alpha Gamma. Who is playing Divinity Original Sin 2, which looks very Baldur's Gate-like. I don't know anything about this game, but it does look very Baldur's Gate-like. Thank you guys for coming to the stream and learning about Dorian Gray with us. I will see you guys again on Tuesday, where we will, who knows what we are going to do. I will figure that out later. Thank you guys for coming. I hope you have a good evening. And we will raid Alpha in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.